From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. July 19, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, WCW Bash at the Beach Review, Jerry Lawler running for mayor, more. By Dave Meltzer. In a press conference that was scheduled for after press time, it was going to be announced that Minnesota Governor and former wrestler Jesse Ventura would be a participant in the 1999 SummerSlam event on August 22 from the Target Center in Minneapolis. Details of his role in the event were apparently to be made clear at a press conference on July 14 in Minneapolis, which would be attended by the top WWF stars. It can't be emphasized strongly enough what a major coup this is, not simply because Ventura's name associated with the show will lead to curiosity buys and strengthen the buy rate. While WWF continues to draw good ratings and maintains loyal fan support, its image from the outside has taken a beating over the past few months. Ventura's association with the event takes the prime WWF story away from stories about the product content, the Rena Merrill lawsuit, and the deaths of Owen Hart and the 3-year-old child in Dallas. That image enhancement and publicity alone coming at this point in time is worth well into 7 figures to the company, even if Ventura doesn't sell one additional pay-per-view buy. But he will. And whatever wrestlers that are associated with him, whether they be in a match he referees or in some form participates in, will benefit from the media rub, which will be substantial. There were literally no hints regarding money figures for Ventura, only that much if not all would go to a charity he'd earmarked the money for. The charity is also a good political position for Ventura to avoid criticism for jumping into a controversial product, and for the WWF to at this point in time very publicly donate 7 figures to a charity. The going rate for celebrities in wrestling being a major star on a pay-per-view event over the past year plus have ranged from about $900,000 for Karl Malone, $1 million for Jay Leno, $2.25 million for Dennis Rodman, and more than $3.5 million for Mike Tyson. One would suspect Ventura in terms of pay-per-view market value would mean more than any of the aforementioned names with the exception of Tyson, and in terms of media value, he could rival Tyson, and he's coming at a time when WWF is far more profitable and at a time where WWF needs this kind of image enhancement badly. In addition, while Tyson took a lot of negative media hits for being in wrestling, he was, after all, Mike Tyson. Ventura as a governor and not someone with the background and criminal record of Tyson, and with wrestling far more risque than it was 15 months ago when Tyson was involved, puts himself at risk of getting a lot of negative publicity for his involvement. There are other aspects of this story most interesting. WCW was also interested in getting involved with Ventura. Both companies had sent him feelers about involvement from when he won the election in November. Ventura left both companies on bad terms, the WWF in 1990 after being fired by McMahon over a video game dispute, and Ventura later successfully sued McMahon over videotape royalties, collecting more than $1 million. Ventura left WCW and Pro Wrestling in 1994 when his performance as an announcer declined and Bobby Heenan passed him by and Eric Bischoff made the call not to use him anymore and let his lucrative contract expire. Ventura, who turns 48 this week, has since blamed his exit on influence from Hulk Hogan, although the seeds were in motion months before Hogan had joined the company and really everyone in charge of WCW since Kip Frey, who was the one who signed Ventura, had a difficult time dealing with him and resented that Frey had signed him to such a big contract, in the $350,000 per year range, which was unheard of money in those days for an announcer. Ventura's last pro wrestling match was in 1986 against Tony Atlas working on a WWF show in Winnipeg after his career as a full-time active competitor largely ended with a 1984 blood clot. It's not inconceivable that he would wrestle, but it would be smarter for it to be in a tag match where his limitation would be 1 spot or 2, but his most likely role would be as a guest referee, where he could get over his authority early, and then at the end, like Tyson, to set things up for one major high spot at the end to end up giving his celebrity rub to help elevate one of the WWF's top faces like Rock or more likely Austin as even more of a mainstream personality. McMahon, Bischoff, and Hogan have all been publicly critical of Ventura in recent weeks, largely stemming from his comments while promoting his autobiography and discussing the death of Owen Hart. Bischoff's comments on Nitro bluntly saying that Ventura was a joke and Hogan's on Larry King, making insinuations about his partying, portraying him as a mid-card wrestler and questioning his honesty, on a story where Hogan's own comments clearly weren't honest, were interesting because the normally thin-skinned Ventura never responded to Hogan. In many ways, rather than say anything publicly to give the remarks credibility, this is probably the strongest way possible to get back at them. While Ventura has been critical of aspects of his dealings with McMahon, he has never seemed to have a personal vendetta against him, even after bitter court fights and being fired at the peak of his career. The same can't be said about his relationship with Hogan. Jerry Lawler officially announced on July 6 that he would be running for mayor of Memphis, and before the week was over, already had his first so-called publicity scandal. Lawler, 49, has been a Memphis wrestling headliner and the biggest consistent drawing card in the history of wrestling in that city from very early into his pro career, which began in 1970. He grew up in Memphis and has lived there virtually his entire life except for years during his childhood when his family moved to Cleveland, hence his long-standing and well-publicized fandom of the old Cleveland Browns. He officially filed for office the next day, trading autographs at the courthouse for signatures on his candidacy petition. Lawler, who had hinted of running for several months, joins a race which at present time already has 12 candidates and may wind up with as many as 15 before filing ends on July 15. With that many candidates siphoning off votes from each other, and with Lawler's celebrity status possibly drawing new voters to the poll, it is generally conceded he will play a major factor in the election, which takes place on October 7. Unlike Jesse Ventura at the start of his campaign, and due to Ventura's success, the formula of which Lawler is attempting to capitalize by positioning himself as an everyday person and a political outsider, the local media and the other candidates are taking Lawler very seriously. Lawler, who had thought about running in the past, thought this was a unique race because there would be so many different candidates and it would be the time to try for the $140,000 per year post. He felt he had a strong chance to win in a racially polarized city, but the official announcement 2 days later that Pete Sisson, former county commissioner, would be running, he felt would make it a lot more difficult. Lawler noted the fact of political life in Memphis is that the mayoral election has always been about racial polarization, and with two big-name African-American candidates as the biggest-name candidates from a political standpoint, the current mayor Willie Herrenton and city councilman Joe Ford, part of a famous Memphis political party, who at this point is considered for favorite although there have been no polls taken, that could split the vote and leave a victory wide open for anyone who gets hot with white voters. The African-American vote is just under 50% of the registered voters in the city. Since there is no runoff, whoever gets the most votes win, and Herrenton in 1991 became the first African-American mayor of Memphis, winning an election by only 142 votes. The feeling is that in a race this crowded that if anyone gets 30% of the vote, they would likely win. Lawler had actually thought of running as far back as the 70s, when he was in his prime as a wrestling draw, and Memphis wrestling drew incredible local television ratings, being the most widely viewed locally produced television show, and its local viewership beat almost all the network programming of that era, at one point peaking with a 23 ratings and a 70-plus share. In his best year, Lawler as the big draw, more fans attended live wrestling in Memphis during the course of a year than any city in the United States, as they ran weekly Monday night shows and averaged close to 8,000 paid at their peak. His name recognition locally stemming from his decades in the ring as the top local star, to doing his own talk shows, television commercials, etc. far exceeded Ventura's in Minnesota before he declared his candidacy. At the time, Lawler wasn't wanting to cut down on his wrestling career, but now with him slowing down his schedule as an in-ring performer, the timing appeared right. Lawler, like Ventura, is trying to portray himself as a common man, an outsider to the system who will vote on common sense rather than as an entrenched politician voting on party lines. His TV soundbite political catchphrase seems to be that common sense isn't very common in City Hall. Ventura's success in being a third-party candidate and shocking the mainstream with his win has caused virtually every major political candidate, including the presidential candidates from both major parties in the year 2000, to re-evaluate their marketing strategies. The two have similarities in that both are very gifted speakers, and Lawler, even more than Ventura, is tremendous at selling himself through his interviews, which is why he was a far bigger star in wrestling, although Ventura had more success outside of wrestling and had a previous political background as mayor of Brooklyn Park, a Minneapolis suburb. Just days into his campaign, Lawler's candidacy on July 8 already made a headline news story when both the League of Women Voters and the National Organization of Women, NOW, complained about Lawler's website, which includes risque photos, as you'd expect on the internet, of a wrestling valet, of his girlfriend Stacey Carter, complaining about it being a sexist portrayal of women and saying that if Lawler was elected, she'd potentially be the city's first lady. Lawler reacted at first by taking the photos off the website, but by the end of the weekend, had put them back on with a message saying that Stacey is in show business, And the nature of show business includes sometimes outlandish costuming. I should know. Stacy's photos that have appeared on this site would be rated PG-13 in the movie business. Now anytime you challenge the entrenched political special interests, they will attack you. The nature of politics today is that they attack even your families, or the ones closest to you. The next day, Lawler was at a softball game in 100-degree weather and as a publicity stunt, called the media and had cameras there while Carter wore a turtleneck sweater and suffocated in the heat, saying that the political situation is so silly it is forcing his girlfriend to dress like this. Although he has yet to do so, Lawler does realize at some point he's going to have to publicly say what he does on the WWF Raw broadcast is purely an entertainer playing a role because of the sexist remarks that are a regular part of his shtick on the show. He aims that to cover for race-baiting remarks he often made to sell tickets, particularly in the 70s when working as a heel. Whether he wins or not, Lawler doesn't expect this to change his status in the WWF, as his current schedule for the new season in September would only require flying to wherever Raw is emanating from on Monday nights, and working one Sunday per month for the pay-per-view. During the election period over the next 3 months, his feeling is that equal times laws shouldn't apply to him either on his international Raw broadcasts as well as his appearances on the local Power Pro television show, which he appeared on July 9th, in a role of an entertainer as long as he isn't campaigning for office while in his role, using the precedent set by allowing television stations to air old Ronald Reagan movies when he was running for president. "I'm not ashamed of being a wrestler," he said. "Wrestling is the reason why people are considering voting for me. I'm not going to say, if elected, I won't wrestle." Lawler, who readily admits not being up to speed on the local political issues that would face him, but in Ventura speak, says he'll be a quick learner, is hopeful that like Ventura, he can surprise the politicians in debates. None are scheduled, but Harrington has asked for 5 debates and wants all the candidates included. Although there are the obvious similarities between Lawler and Ventura, their wrestling background and gift of gab, and the fact both were in the same lead heel broadcaster role with the WWF during the WWF's 2 biggest runs, there are major differences as well. Ventura was a Navy SEAL, which he pushed hard during his campaign, and had some previous experience in politics both as a mayor and as a drive-time talk show host. Lawler's talk show experience was limited to friendly interviews, largely worked around building up wrestling angles, and while he has a reputation for being a good enough talker to charm his way out of trouble, he's less experienced in dealing with politics and political issues and even less restrained about perceived enemies than even Ventura. Ventura was able to portray himself as a loyal family man with a long and apparently very successful marriage in a profession where that is often the exception to the rule. In 1994, when Lawler was under indictment for an alleged incident with an underage girl, which ended up being dropped when the girl recanted her story, although Lawler did plead guilty to a misdemeanor harassing a witness charge in the deal to drop the charges, the common school of thought under indictment that any lawyer would say would be to keep quiet. Lawler took the opposite approach, so confident in his ability to talk his way out of the bad publicity, making strong defenses of himself and talking heavily about the case not only on local news shows and national wrestling media appearances, but even on the wrestling television show. It worked, as in Memphis, he was able to get the local publicity to portray the situation as him being the victim of a prosecutor from another city trying to make a name for herself. His wrestling career, while highly successful on a local basis, was filled with contradictions and coming up with every stunt under the sun to push ticket sales, as Memphis was probably the most innovative wrestling city in the world during its peak period in the late 70s and early 80s. In later years, the company that Lawler owned with Jerry Jarrett was able to survive longer than any of the regional offices run out of business largely by Vince McMahon and later Jim Crockett and Ted Turner's expansions. Lawler was at one point a sworn hated enemy of the WWF. Lawler's ownership of the local company was something kept secret from the public since he doubled as the biggest star. At one point when WWF would run shows in Memphis before USWA and WWF joined forces after McMahon hired Lawler to replace his cousin Roy Wayne Ferris, Honky Tonk Man, in the broadcast booth as a color commentator, that WWF wrestling was fake after the company's admissions in state legislatures attempting to have wrestling deregulated, while the local brand was real. At one point he successfully sued the WWF over the rights to use the name King, which WWF was using for Harley Race, with the courts ruling Lawler, due to long prior usage, should be the only wrestler with the right to use that name in Tennessee. When WWF and WCW would run shows in Memphis during periods of competition, Lawler would often run down the companies and talk about the poor quality of shows the opposition was putting on and hint at them being a show and the local version being for real. Lawler never let on, among other things, locally about being part owner of the wrestling company for the obvious credibility reasons of him being the top star, and for years tried to keep quiet that his sons, in particular Brian, were actually his sons, for fear fans would see him as old if he had children old enough to be pro wrestlers. When Lawler was in a similar situation in Mississippi running casino shows and as part of licensing was forced to admit wrestling wasn't real, in the sporting sense, which drew a lot of local headlines, he immediately went back on the wrestling show the next week and claimed he didn't mean what he said, claimed he wasn't really even the wrestling promoter, and he just said it because government red tape was going to cost him an exorbitant amount of money. Lawler, according to longtime business partner Jerry Jarrett, who an incredible main eventer performer, but as good as he was at selling himself, was equally as bad when it came to business, but the two made a good team because Jarrett was strong at the business end and largely handled that aspect of the business in what was largely a long and successful partnership. Lawler and Jarrett generally within wrestling were not well liked by the wrestlers, because it was readily known no matter how popular a wrestler would get, they would never be allowed to get more popular over the long haul than Lawler. Jarrett used to talk of it as protecting his territory. Since Lawler was co-owner, he'd never leave and work opposition and why allow someone to overshadow him who would then leave the area for greener pastures, and the wrestlers were notoriously poorly paid in that part of the country. They were often criticized for their brand of wrestling by other promoters for this became popular, turning wrestling into a gimmick-oriented circus and leaving the athletic credibility behind. The two were grudgingly respected for running a successful territory for themselves, and they did run some of the best angles anywhere in the world. And ultimately, there was the messy court case revolving around the USWA's eventual demise, a lawsuit that Lawler was both a plaintiff and defendant in different aspects of, that he wound up from a legal standpoint smelling like a rose when the verdict came out after cutting a deal of buying Jarrett's half and reselling it to a Cleveland consortium, turning it over the 4 times the price. The verdict came much to the surprise of both the judge, who was throughout the trial encouraging him to settle out of court because he felt things weren't going his way, and even by his own lawyer, who was talking with him before the verdict was handed in about plans for an appeal. As many in wrestling have noted, Lawler has far more skeletons in his closet than Ventura through his public dealings, such as his close business association with shady characters such as Larry Bertman, who was the big courtroom loser when the verdict in the aforementioned trial went down. Lawler was made into a national name with his 1982 angle with Andy Kaufman that was played up in many circles as being real. There was a similar angle, which garnered a lot of publicity, which Lawler claimed he wasn't in on, although freely admits it was a publicity stunt perpetrated by Jim Carrey, which presented Lawler to the media as someone who attacked Carrey after being spit on and being thrown out of the movie Man in the Moon. About the life of Kaufman, with Lawler playing himself, which will be released toward the end of this year. Even today, Lawler has a case out regarding allegedly running over the foot of an airport officer a few months ago who gave him an illegal parking ticket. He admits to crumbling up the ticket and throwing it to the ground, but not running over the woman's foot, and claimed hidden surveillance cameras will show the woman exaggerated any injuries, which he turned into positive publicity by portraying himself as the celebrity victim of someone looking to cash in on a lawsuit. Jack Brisco, one of the biggest pro wrestling stars of the 70s, remains in intensive care at press time in Tampa with incorrect media reports on his condition panicking wrestlers around the world from his generation. Brisco, 57, who held the NWA World Heavyweight twice and the NCAA Championship while in college at Oklahoma State, has been hospitalized and laid up on his back for the past 30 days, in serious condition for a variety of ailments which began with back surgery to remove a tumor. Brisco, the older brother of WWF executive and television personality Gerald Brisco, contracted a bacterial infection which turned into pneumonia from the surgery, which led to more complications, including a staph infection and fluid in the lungs. He needed 2 additional surgeries to remove the fluid. At press time he was actually beginning recovery, and it was likely he'd be transferred out of intensive care this week, and he's expected to eventually make a full recovery, but the recuperation period is expected to be long. A Tampa radio station, K99, reported Brisco as having died of a heart attack on July 9, which led to other media following suit. At the WCW pay-per-view event on July 11, the older wrestlers and employees who worked with Brisco when he was at one time arguably the biggest star in the world were expecting the worst, with stories of him being in bad condition from a massive heart attack. Both the WWF website and the WCW hotline reported Brisco having suffered a heart attack, although sources close to the situation and WWF sources, those reports are untrue. It is known that Gerald Brisco called up the Tampa station and was furious at the report of his brother's death. Brisco was considered by his contemporaries as one of the greatest true wrestlers ever to perform in pro wrestling. A star collegiate wrestler, he won the NCAA championship at 191 pounds in 1965, and turned pro for Leroy McGuirk 1 year later. While not bulky by the standards of most pro wrestlers, He had a certain athletic look and uncanny quickness and skill far beyond virtually all the performers of his era, combined with good looks. Eddie Graham, who promoted Florida, brought him into his territory in 1969 and groomed Brisco to be his replacement as the area's top babyface. He reached the top quickly, winning the Florida title from Masa Saito and made his name worldwide with a series of matches with Dory Funk Jr. over the NWA title, which are considered the classic wrestling encounters of their era, including 60-minute draws throughout the world and even a handful of 90-minute matches. When Brisco and Funk drew a sellout on January 1, 1970 in St. Louis for Sam Muchnick, it was strongly assumed Brisco would be the star to carry the NWA throne for most of the 70s. The legend of the matches was so strong that even though the feud started in 1969, Dory vs. Jack and Funk's vs. Brisco's remained a marquee feud around the world as late as 1984. Brisco was scheduled to win the title from Dory on March 2, 1973 in Houston, but a few days before the booking, Dory, who had held the title for more than 4 years, claimed a shoulder separation and an accident on his father's ranch and was out of action several weeks. Houston ended up getting Brisco's title win, at which point Muchnick debuted the famous red NWA belt emblematic of the organization in the 70s, but it was from Harley Race on July 20, 1973, who had beaten Funk weeks earlier in Kansas City, except for a 1-week period where he lost and regained the title in Japan to Giant Baba. Brisco remained NWA champion until losing it on December 10, 1975 in Miami Beach to Terry Funk, burned out by the schedule, at which point he disappeared from wrestling for about 6 months. After he returned, he remained a headliner for the remainder of his career, retiring in 1984 while working for the WWF, but his most effective role was really as a challenger, coming close in classic matches with Dory. He was largely considered a very good world champion, although he burned out toward the end, but an even better young challenger. In Japan he was a major star as well, headlining legendary matches for All Japan against Baba, Dory, and Jumbo Tsuruta, and then going to New Japan for famous matches with both Antonio Inoki and Tatsumi Fujinami. But without question, from a historical standpoint in this business, even more than his worldwide superstardom in the ring internationally during the 70s was his role in changing the face of the industry in 1984. The Brisco brothers each had invested heavily in Georgia Championship Wrestling, which at the time was not doing well at the gate but had a very valuable contract with WTBS, the Atlanta Superstation, which drew great television ratings at a time when nobody cared about television ratings in wrestling. Vince McMahon had just begun to take the WWF nationally a few months earlier after garnering a time slot on the fledgling USA Network, and was ready to make some big moves, in particular linking rock star Cyndi Lauper with his product, which would give pro wrestling its first pop mainstream publicity nationally in decades. The decision by the Briscos, along with other minor stockholders in GCW Incorporated to sell their stock to McMahon for approximately $750,000 gave McMahon the contract to WTBS, which meant during the first media hype period of the summer of 1984 through the spring of 1985, McMahon, who actually folded GCW after offering all of its top stars a job, only a few accepted, and they were all quickly phased out, had the only wrestling company with a strong national outlet in a good time slot during that period. Ole Anderson, who was the general manager of GCW, managed to start up a new company with some of the local Georgia promoters called Championship Wrestling from Georgia Incorporated, but it was put on a 7 a.m. Saturday morning time slot and the company had little money and didn't draw at the box office, causing most of its big stars to leave for bigger money territories such as the Carolinas and the AWA. Jack and Jerry, who were working as a heel tag team in the Carolinas as NWA World Tag Team Champions, started wrestling for the WWF. One day in late 1984, after a long road grind, Jack told Jerry he was tired of the road and he was going home. He never wrestled again. It's hard to imagine today the kind of heat and the fierce promotional war that both Briscos took for selling their stock to McMahon. Hindsight would show without question it was a good business decision for them, but it would be an understatement to say it was a key part in sealing the direction the wrestling war would go during a key period. During their 1 year together in business, Ted Turner, who owned the station, and McMahon, had one run-in after another. While McMahon likes to tell the story differently, at the time Turner was besieged with letters from local and national fans who wanted their familiar NWA brand of wrestling back, and not tapes sent in that were essentially the same as what already aired on the USA Network and in syndication in many markets. Turner first tried to legally get out of the contract with McMahon, claiming he wasn't taping the show live at the TV studio in Atlanta. This led to McMahon for a very short period of time actually doing studio tapings every Saturday morning, flying wrestlers in from around the country where they had performed the previous night. The ratings for the shows on both Saturday and Sunday were strong, but not as strong as they had been during the Anderson days. Turner then gave a new time slot to Bill Watts Mid-South Sports and made a verbal deal with Watts to go into business with him. Watts' tapes in a new time slot actually drew slightly higher ratings than McMahon's in the traditional slot. Eventually, when it became obvious McMahon and Turner couldn't coexist, McMahon, strongly encouraged to do so, sold his contract for the TBS time slots to Jim Crockett for $1 million. A little more than 3 years later, Crockett was facing bankruptcy as he was failing largely due to weaker marketing and incredibly bad booking, and sold his company to Turner. Turner was at the time just looking at keeping his traditionally strong Saturday and Sunday wrestling shows on the air as much as wanting to get into the wrestling business itself, and as they say, the rest is history. In another political situation that ended with a surprising result, the Oregon House of Representatives voted down Senate Bill 238 on both July 6 and July 7, which appears to mean that WWF and WCW will continue with their policy of not coming to the state. The bill, whose main task was to give the police department enforcement power over commission regulations, had a provision tacked onto it which would eliminate drug testing for national touring pro wrestling groups. It was the Oregon Commission drug testing policy, testing for illegal recreational drugs such as cocaine. Although steroids were a huge part of the debate, the Commission does not and never has tested for steroids at this point, although the law gives them the right to do so, and there have been hints testing for steroids may be added, as well as for HIV. That is the prime reason both WWF and WCW have avoided running shows in the state. After Governor John Kitzhaber made it clear even if the bill passed the House that he would veto it, the legislature, which was expected to approve of the bill which flew through the Senate, voted it down 28-26 on July 6, with 5 legislators not voting. A second vote a day later saw the bill officially killed by a 33-26 margin. To basically exempt this group of individuals is just not acceptable to me, Kitzhaber said in a front-page story of the Oregonian. Kitzhaber also publicly said he felt it would send a bad message to kids to change the laws regarding drug testing because of the appearance that the big companies felt they couldn't abide by them, being that the drugs tested for are all illegal to begin with. One of the big contradictions of the bill is that the local wrestlers working independent shows would still have been subject to the same drug tests even if the bill had passed. Over the past week, the bill had become a major issue, not only on the State House floor, but on local radio news and sports talk shows. Ironically, with the least discussed aspect of the bill being the actual drug issue within wrestling that it pertains to. While there are two schools of thought, both valid, when it comes to this argument, neither appeared to have been a factor in the eventual decision. The argument can be that other entertainment events do not have their performers drug tested, and why should pro wrestling be singled out, instead of perhaps the strip club industry, which is just as if not more sleazy and where drug use is probably just as prevalent. The other argument is why change the law, as Kitzhaber noted, because big companies can't abide by it, which comes off as almost an admission of guilt and sending a bad message. There had been times in the past where the WWF, during the period they were doing extensive drug testing, had given the indication they would return to Portland and abide by the drug testing if the Commission dropped the HIV aspect of the testing, although there had been no recent indication that was still the case. At one point several years ago, before a show in Oregon, Hulk Hogan had the blood submitted for testing ahead of time under his name for an HIV test by the WWF, which turned out to actually be the blood of ring announcer Howard Finkel. Instead, the issues regarded the sleaziness of the Raw television show, with the callers seemingly divided into believing that somehow this bill was going to amend a ban on WWF and WCW events. Those for the bill claimed the current law amounted to government censorship of an entertainment industry, while those against it pointed to the sleazy nature of the current product as something they felt shouldn't be allowed into the state, neither of which should have been considered valid points regarding the subject. Even on the House floor, it appears the strange coalition of conservative Republicans put off by the sexual aspects, profanity and violence of the current television product, combined with liberal Democrats following the lead of the governor, put the bill down to the mat for the pin. Dan Gardner, a Portland Democrat who carried the bill, lobbied heavily by the local arena, the Rose Garden, which has been wanting to run lucrative WWF and WCW live events, to the House floor, was so confident of its passing that before the voting began he said, "Let's get ready to rumble. No word if Michael Buffer will attempt to file suit against him for that, and pass this bill." After the vote came in, he shook his head and said, "It must have been the day, the water, whatever." Instead of debates over the issue itself, the question of whether wrestling, being primarily entertainment, should be governed similar to boxing, a dangerous sport, although as it turns out wrestling has a higher injury and death rate, were the debates over the drug problems within the issue and what message this sends to make this double standard about big money wrestling offices being exempt from regulations smaller local companies have to live with. It appeared to go down due to outside reasons. The bill passed 22-5 in the Senate, but support in the bill stalled going to the floor, delayed by those that were pushing it trying to keep it until the end of the session so time would pass since the death of Owen Hart. While local media didn't point to Hart's death as a reason for the bill failing, it became very clear a prime reason was the University of Indiana/Inside Edition study of 50 Raw episodes. You know, the 1,658 instances in 1 year of pointing to the crotch and 128 examples of simulated sexual activity, which was brought up on the House floor and led to many conservative Republicans voting the bill down. There is even more politics involved in this bill as it pertains to Oregon, in particular Portland, and pro wrestling. There is expected to be over the next few years a new large coliseum built in Vancouver, Washington, which is part of the Portland metropolitan area, but across the river and the state line. When the new arena is built, there would be more pressure on the legislature from the Rose Garden Arena to relax the standards within Oregon, which may have been part of the bill, as the wrestling companies could then play the Portland market by going to the new arena, and the state would lose out on the tax money and the building would lose out in being able to be competitive to get a lucrative entertainment event. It didn't appear that realistic lay and the land aspect of a few years down the road with the potential of a new arena being open that would negate companies having to deal with the Oregon Commission while still playing the state's only lucrative market had even entered into the House debate. WCW's downswing continued with its July 11th Bash at the Beach pay-per-view, a show combining poorly conceived ideas with largely bad matches and a crowd that came to see a big event and somewhere along the way found it more interesting to watch the antics of beach balls being bounced through the crowd. The leadership of WCW has to be brought into question over the actions over the past week. Not only was this show the result of total incompetence from the booking committee, both in matches which on paper weren't entertaining going in and stipulations that were never fully explained and in one case simply ignored, but a ridiculously brutal hardcore battle royal cost more than $100,000 to produce, was hyped so poorly it didn't result in as much as one added buy to the show, was so poorly lit it was nearly impossible to watch on television, and resulted in several needless injuries for wrestlers taking crazy bumps that didn't even get over because of how it was shot and looked. The battle royal, said to be an excellent spectacle live, taking place at a junkyard which was about a 40-minute drive from the National Car Rental Center in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where the rest of the show was taking place, was blamed by several fans live for killing the heat for the rest of the night. There was heat during the week because of the apparent portrayal of domestic violence where Savage slapped Tori Wilson and violently threw down Gorgeous George. While far more violent men beating up women scenes occur weekly on WWF and ECW, WCW can be more heavily criticized for playing it up in the press that they are the clean ones. Many also noted that Savage's throwing down George was more of a portrayal of domestic violence than women taking chair shots, guitar shots and cane shots, which are clearly cartoon wrestling spots, even when the blows are stiff. The heat came down heavily on Bischoff, since more of the Time Warner brass was at the show live at the Georgia Dome. Savage's antics were not laid out by the booking committee and apparently Wilson didn't know she was going to be slapped. Savage and George probably both knew what was happening but nobody else seemed to. There was tremendous heat all week on Savage to the point that legitimately all were told to go home rather than appear on the live Thunder. This appeared to be some communication problems as well as Mike Tenay during the broadcast talked about Savage, Sid and the women being there and going to appear, then later said they wouldn't be appearing without giving an explanation. WCW employees were told all references to the slap and throwing down to be taken off the website, and no clips of the final Nitro scene, which was abruptly cut off, were allowed to appear in packages on the shows the rest of the week. However, George came to ringside with sunglasses, then took them off to reveal two black eyes, one of which was more prominent than the other. But in typical WCW fashion, the announcers never acknowledged them even when close-ups made them obvious. And then, as further punishment, when the show was over, Savage held the WCW title, even if it was only a one-day transitional reign to get the belt back to Hulk Hogan, when George went with Nash, and then turned on him at the end of the match. It was a night where there was one good match, which the live crowd didn't react to much until the very end. There was nobody really over. Well, except Bill Goldberg, and he wasn't even there. It had been poorly promoted on television for the most part. The referee bumps became numbing parodies of bad booking. While there have been a lot of bad pay-per-view events from all three major companies, this was the one show which maybe more than any others came across like a waste of time to watch. There have been worse shows, but they at least came across as having a purpose. The live event drew 13,624 fans, which was 11,397 paying $444,737 and another $71,115 in merchandise. In a tryout match involving some very small Florida independent workers, CJAFI and Jeremy Lopez beat Jamie Howard in Jet Jaguar. The show opened with Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan, without Mike Tenay. Tenay was on location at the Junkyard getting ready for the Battle Royale, which was poorly promoted on television with rules that weren't even formulated until the day of the event. However, when it came time to announce the event, Schiavone and Heenan announced it from the building watching their monitors. The two did their classic boring job, save for Heenan having one funny line when Judy Bagwell was chasing Ric Flair around the ring that she was chasing him for a date. 1. Ernest Miller pinned Disco Inferno Glenn Gilberti in 8:07. The stipulations for this match were supposed to be that the loser wouldn't be allowed to dance in WCW ever again. The stips were announced on WCW Saturday Night and on the pregame show, but never on either Nitro or Thunder nor talked about before or during the match itself. Miller challenged Disco to a dance contest at the beginning and attacked him while dancing. Disco came back stomping on Cat's hat. The match was pretty bad. Disco used the last dance stunner, but Sonny Wanu had the ref distracted. This gave Miller a chance to put on his red dancing shoe and kick Disco in the side of the head for the pin. After the pin, Schiavone said that there was a stipulation that the loser couldn't dance, but that stipulation was removed and that Disco can still dance. 1/2 star. 2. Rick Steiner, Robert Reich-Steiner, pinned Van Hammer, Mark Ty Hildreth, in 4:51 to retain the WCW TV title. Schiavone talked about Hammer being a young star. Isn't he, like 39 years old? There was decent heat for the opener, but the crowd died here immediately. Steiner was real stiff. He actually appeared to be killing Hammer at times. Hammer used a chair shot and a clothesline off the top. Steiner came back with 2 low blows, a clothesline and a sky-high bulldog for the pin. The bulldog, due to the angle, looked really uncomfortable. Dud. 3. David Flair, retained the U.S. title, pinning Dean Malenko, Dean Simon, in 3:05. Torrie Wilson was back in David's corner. They didn't even make an attempt to explain that one other than saying her 72 hours with Nash must have been up. Except, David won that match and she left voluntarily. My head hurts. They really should get migraine pills as a company sponsor. Malenko actually did probably the best job of his career in carrying this to a negative star match. He got David in the cloverleaf, but Arn Anderson gave ref Johnny Boone the spinebuster. Malenko then kicked and slammed Asya, and put her in the cloverleaf. Charles Robinson pulled Boone's ref shirt off and put it on. Ric Flair hit Malenko with high shoe and David pinned him. After the match, Anderson stomped Malenko into the ground in the aisle. -1 star. 4. Conan Charles Ashenoff, and Rey Mysterio Jr., Oscar Gutierrez, and Swollen and B.A. Robert James Jr. won an elimination match over Curt Hennig and Barry Windham, Kendall Windham and Bobby Duncombe Jr. in 15 minutes. Both teams got 50-50 reactions. The song is getting Hennig's ring entrance over big and making him a pretty big star. There were people in the crowd singing the song during the entrance, but it isn't like everyone is doing it yet. It really killed the No Limit Soldiers because Conan, even playing hometown boy and announced from Miami, which is actually where he grew up instead of Mexico City, got way less of a reaction to his ring entrance than usual. This was probably the second best match on the show, and it was still a mess in many ways. Huge Teddy Reed was given the name 4 times for. The eliminations and the booking were a mess, although from the booking it appears they were designing the match to put the Cowboys over as the faces, since they were the ones with the disadvantage and thus put in the face underdog position. Swollen pinned Duncombe Jr. first in 6:26 after Mysterio Jr. delivered a leg drop from the apron back in. This was not the planned finish, but things got really messed up between Duncombe and Swollen, and he just told Swollen to pin him. No matter what name he goes by and what gimmick he uses, B.A. is still a great wrestler in the ring and has no charisma. He and Hennig did some good wrestling, ending when Hennig pinned him in 9:07 after the Fisherman Suplex. Conan pinned Kendall Windham in 10:52 with a cradle after Mysterio Jr. hit him with a springboard dropkick. The next elimination was really weird. The idea appeared to be Conan and Barry to both be counted out. Windham was outside the ring. Conan was appearing to tire. Chase Tatum then aggressively jumped on Windham and was pounding him to the back. Conan seemingly just walked to the back for absolutely no reason and was counted out. He never even returned for the finish winner's celebration, which may indicate punishment and fallout over the USA Today quotes. This left Hennig alone against Mysterio Jr. and Swollen. Before it got going, Barry Windham ran back out and was chased away by Tatum. It ended with Mysterio Jr. jumping off Swollen's shoulders with a splash onto Hennig for the pin at 15 minutes. 1.5 stars. 5. David Finlay won a Junkyard Dog Battle Royal in 1350. It was never mentioned in hype beforehand, nor during the match itself, that the winner would become the first WCW Hardcore Champion. However, the next night at Nitro, Finlay was given a trophy, later stolen by Jimmy Hart's first family, and announced as the first champion because of winning this match. This was done in a junkyard, with cars neatly set up, a few fires lit for lighting. There was no professional lighting, and by this point it was totally dark outside. A bunch of wrestlers were there. They were never announced, and some it wasn't apparent were there until late into the match. The rules were that the first person to climb out of the junkyard over the fence would win. Of course, given that as the rules, except at one point nobody ever tried to climb out, so there was no drama of guys trying to climb and being pulled out. They knocked a car off a big pile and it crashed down early. They had a helicopter filming along with a camera on the ground. You couldn't really see much other than the guys were out there killing each other, and it was hilarious to see La Parka, Adolfo Tapio, running around in jeans instead of his wrestling outfit. The helicopter shots were totally useless as you couldn't see a thing. At least 3 guys were hurt. Silver King, Cesar Gonzalez, was all bloody from a deep shoulder wound that needed 60 stitches to close. Hawk, James Fullington, was hospitalized and suffered a separated shoulder and a possible neck injury as well. Hugh Morris, William DeMott, who was suffering a major bad luck streak, needed stitches in his hand when he put it through a windshield. Mikey Whipwreck also suffered a concussion. They might as well have done a Brawl for All tournament for the risk to rewards ratio of this match. The difference is, WWF will never do another Brawl for All, and WCW will make this an annual event. Among the wrestlers involved besides those already mentioned included Public Enemy, Ted Petty and Mike Durham, Jerry Flynn, William Brenneman, Steven Regal, Darren Matthews, Horace Hogan, Michael Balia, David Taylor, Brian Knobs, Ryan Yendrasovitz, Cyclope Ramon Ibarra, and Mikey Whipwreck, John Watson. Jimmy Hart was also there directing traffic. At one point Cyclope did a moonsault off 3 cars, but they may have not even shown that. It was way too long. The finish saw Hawk put Finlay in the trunk of a car. Unfortunately, it was clear the trunk didn't shut. It popped open once when it wasn't supposed to. Finlay then got out and they put the car into a car smasher, so I guess Finlay escaping saved him from a sure death. A point Schiavone made sure we knew about. Then another car blew up, which supposedly kept all the other wrestlers in the battlefield, while Finlay, who had escaped, climbed over the fence to win. It's not fair to rate this because the guys clearly worked really hard and it was largely unwatchable television. 6. Diamond Dallas Page, Paige Falkenberg, and Bam Bam Bigelow, Scott Bigelow, and Chris Kanyon, Chris Klusaritis, retained the WCW tag titles, beating Chris Benoit and Perry Saturn, Perry Sotolo, in 23-17. Sorry, but I just can't get into 3 guys being allowed to face 2 in tag title matches. That said, they had a good match. The Triad are doing a bunch of catchphrases that aren't over yet. This was really good work, but the crowd was totally taken out of the show live with the previous match. There were loud crowd reactions during this match, but it had nothing to do with the match, as you could see the crowd looking elsewhere. Apparently there were 5 or 6 beach balls being batted around, which was the main thrust of crowd interest until the last few minutes. If Saturn would drop the punches and maybe the head kicks, his work would improve 50% because his flying moves, suplexes and wrestling is really good, but his punch/kick looks really fake and takes away a lot. Benoit and Kanyon were really good, although everyone did their role well. Benoit and Saturn did a double nose blowing spot on Kanyon. Yuck. Schiavone was talking about Bigelow being a high school All-American wrestler, which isn't the case, although he was a very good high school wrestler. They beat up on Saturn for a long time. Benoit made a hot tag and was cut off. Page actually fell off the top rope, but he wasn't hurt and made a quick recovery to almost make it look like a planned slip. Benoit was then pounded on forever. Bigelow missed a moonsault and Benoit hot tagged Saturn. Saturn took Page and Kanyon over the top with a double clothesline. Saturn did a high splash on Bigelow and Benoit followed with a diving headbutt, then Saturn hit a Northern Lights suplex on Page. Ref bump. Kanyon threw power at Saturn and Page. Blinded a bit by the powder as well, accidentally gave Kanyon a diamond cutter, but Bigelow put Canyon's leg on the ropes. Benoit got a great near fall on Page with a German suplex. The last few minutes of this were so good that the crowd, which didn't care, was really popping. Then another near fall. By this point people were groaning about all the ref bumps. Page hit Benoit, and then hit Kanyon with this mini trash can, but then did a double team diamond cutter on Saturn for the pin. 3.5 stars. 7. Buff Bagwell, Marcus Bagwell, pinned Roddy Piper. Roderick Toombs in 34 of the third round of a boxing match with Mills Lane as referee. This was bad, but it could have been worse. Actually, Piper did a very good job of doing work boxing, and Bagwell was also better than expected. Piper didn't even appear to tire even at 48 years of age with those big gloves. Bagwell tired, but not to the point he couldn't perform. Lane came out with a judge's robe on, then took it off to wear his referee's shirt. The gloves were huge, like giant pillows, which allowed them to not have to pull the blows as much. Before Bagwell came out, Schiavone screamed, "Listen to this ovation," and then he came out and got only a tepid reaction. Bagwell said since he knew Piper would have Flair in the corner, that he had a secret weapon in his corner, and called out his mother Judy. That'll really get him over with the guys who think he's an annoying pretty boy, bringing his mommy to help him fight. There was no reaction at all for Judy. All I could think about was how far Flair has fallen, knowing that sometime in the next 15 minutes he was going to have to sell for a nearly 60-year-old woman. It was supposed to be 3-minute rounds as advertised and announced. In the first round, it went 2:16, which was just as well as Bagwell was tiring, but it wasn't that bad. After that, Schiavone announced that all rounds would be 2 minutes. Piper knocked down Bagwell in the first round. Even though Piper is 19 years older, it was pretty clear he'd destroy him in a boxing match. Second round saw Flair put something on Piper's gloves which he used to blind Bagwell. Bagwell was selling and went down again. In the third round, Judy bit Piper's ear. We knew with Mills Lane that was coming. She then dumped water and put a bucket on his head. Bagwell did the old haymaker to the bucket gimmick, and Piper was stunned, and Bagwell delivered the blockbuster. Lane counted 1, 2, 3 without hitting the mat. Pin in a boxing match? After everything else on the show, it made perfect sense. Judy chased Flair around the ring after the match. 1/2 star. 8. Randy Savage, Randy Poffo, and Sid Vicious. Sid Aoudi defeated Sting, Steve Borden, and Kevin Nash in 13:21, with Savage pinning Nash to capture the WCW heavyweight title. Michael Buffer claimed it was the first time in history that the WCW title was ever put up in a tag team match. Nobody ever explained how it would be possible for Sting to pin Nash when they were on the same team, even though that angle was pushed the last several days. I guess it makes as much sense as everything else. Sting got no crowd reaction coming out, and Nash got only slightly better. Fans started changing for Goldberg. George went into Nash's corner. Sting was mainly beat up after missing a Stinger splash onto Savage and hitting the guardrail, being dropped on the guardrail by Sid and posted by the women. The only pop of the match was Sting giving Miss Madness and Medusa a double noggin knocker. Sting accidentally hit the Stinger splash on Nash. Sid choke slammed Sting. George went in the ring to give Nash a low blow. Her first low blow came nowhere close. Nash didn't sell, and she froze. Nash stood there and waited, and finally she hit him with another one. Sid then bodyslammed Nash and dropped him in the wrong position, making it even a harder angle for Savage to hit the elbow for the pin. Nash and Sting did shake hands after the show went off the air in front of the crowd. -1 star. WCW presented the return of Hulk Hogan, with a world title win over his longtime rival Randy Savage, but only dented Raw's overwhelming lead in the July 12 ratings. Raw only doubled WCW in 2 of the 8 quarters en route to scoring a 5.99 rating, 5.41 first hour, 6.52 seconds hour, with a 9.6 share. Nitro finished with a 3.45 rating, 3.53 first hour, 3.09 seconds hour, 3.72 third hour, with a 5.7 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes, Raw did a 5.97 to Nitro's 3.42. The Hogan-Savage title change, with Nash helping Hogan, and leading to a Nash challenge to Hogan for the title on the Road Wild pay-per-view on August 14th, drew a 4.72 final quarter, WCW's best competitive quarter hour in a long time, but fell as the match progressed, with the overrun period of the final 4 minutes of the match and the challenge doing a 4.54. On the other hand, Raw, with Austin and Show vs. Undertaker and Kane, drew a 6.33 final quarter and grew to a 7.16 overrun. A slight bit of that went unopposed, with Raw going about 1 minute longer, so the period head-to-head against the ending of Nitro was actually a 6.88 against Nitro's 4.54. The only notable items of the rating is that the Ric Flair vs. Dean Malenko match for WCW, which started the head-to-head period, which included a Sting run-in at the end, performed strongly as WCW dropped from a 3.61 for the final unopposed quarter hour. WCW overall had a very weak first hour, but Hogan Savage picked the show up to where it did slightly better than it has been doing. to a 3.46, which is a shockingly little drop considering Raw opened with Austin and McMahon and Undertaker with the angle to set up the contract signing for the next pay-per-view event, which did a 4.70. Much of the audience stayed for the Flair match, then made the switch as the second quarter, with WWF having Gangrel vs. Edge grew to a 5.51 while WCW with Regal vs. Kidman fell to 2.66. The biggest gap in the other quarter, which Raw doubled Nitro, was Raw's real star quarter, the X-Pac and Road Dogg and Rock vs. Triple H and China and Gunn match at 6.73, destroying Nitro's 2.95 for an angle where Finlay got the Hardcore Trophy and it turned into a C-Team Battle Royal. For the weekend of July 10th and 11th, Livewire did a 1.5, Superstars a 1.9, Sunday Night Heat a 3.78 and WCW Saturday Night a 1.9. WCW Thunder, which has fallen big the last 2 weeks, on July 8th did a 2.79 rating. For July 5th, Raw did a 5.96 rating, 5.68 first hour, 6.21 seconds hour, and a 10.1 share. Nitro did a 3.28 rating, 3.85 first hour, 3.31 seconds hour, 2.75 third hour, and a 5.7 share. Because it was the final day of a holiday weekend, the wrestling audience was down more because there were fewer viewers watching television overall than the beginning of a pattern of ratings falling. Based on the shares for a normal Monday night, it would have been more like 6.7 to 3.8, or the high end and not the low end of what the shows have been doing in recent months. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 6 minutes, Raw's 5.96 exactly doubled Nitro's head-to-head 2.98. There was little in the way of major stories that week other than Megadeth was just that, and the ratings with Raw doing a 6.61 for Rock vs. Triple H in a cage opposite Megadeth and the surprise cameo of Goldberg, which did a 2.13 rating, the lowest rated quarter hour in years for a Nitro broadcast. Nitro did do a 3.75 for its 8-minute overrun with the Nash vs. Sid title match and post-match with the fake and real Sting and domestic violence angle. The last 2 minutes of that were unopposed, so the real number was likely closer to 3.5 head-to-head, with continuing at 6.62 for the conclusion of the cage match. The appearance of Bret Hart did a 4.2 rating unopposed and continued for just over 2 minutes into the opposed first quarter, which overall for the quarter did a 3.6 to Raw's 5.3 for Austin, McMahon and Rock doing interviews. WCW was hopeful Hart's first appearance would close the usual gap or perhaps even win a quarter, but Hart ended his interview abruptly and several minutes earlier than expected, so if it would have meant anything for the first quarter, it really didn't. For the July 3rd and 4th weekend, Livewire did a 1.6, Superstars did a 1.8, and Sunday Night Heat did its all-time low with a 2.65 rating, although considering it was on at 7 p.m. on July 4th, that number is hardly indicative of a falling trend. WCW Saturday Night did a 1.8, while Thunder on July 1st fell to a 2.72 rating. Japanese Television Rundown. June 11th, Pancrase. 1. Chris Lytle beat Daisuke Watanabe in 5:30 when he got a front guillotine. The strange thing about this finish is that Watanabe was in the ropes when trapped, and instead of grabbing the ropes for a break, he tapped out. Lytle dominated the striking early. 2. Daisuke Ishii won a unanimous decision over Kosei Kubota after 10 minutes. This result is something of an upset. Ishii dominated the striking standing, also had a lot of slaps from the top as time was running out. Kubota must have injured his knee in the match as he had to be carried out of the ring and was in great pain. 3. Takafumi Ito went to a 10-minute draw with a 3-minute overtime against Rishi Yanagisawa. Ito, who is much smaller, was very aggressive, but it was an even match overall. 4. Jason DeLucia beat Ikuiza Minowa via unanimous decision after 10 minutes. Minowa actually near got an armbar in the first minute. Later DeLucia got his back and nearly got a choke and an over and under choke as well. DeLucia dominated the grappling, particularly toward the end. 5. Sanae Kikuta beat Eric Geddick in 120 when he got a choke right away. Kikuta, to entertain the audience, went out and tried a dropkick at the bell, but Geddick easily sidestepped it. That kind of showboating could get you in a lot of trouble. 6. Yoshiki Takahashi went to a 10-minute draw with a 3-minute overtime draw against John LeBay. This was a good match of former UFC competitors. Tito Ortiz was part of LeBay's entourage and was shown and interviewed. When asked about Pancrase, Ortiz said he's under contract to UFC through the end of the year, but at that point, he'd be interested. LeBay came out to Iron Man, but to pro wrestling fans in Japan even today, some 14 years after their glory period, that still means Road Warriors and nothing else. Takahashi got the better of the stand-ups, but Lebay would continually take him down. The fact Lebay could always take him down was a surprise since Takahashi was a very good college wrestler before going pro. Most of the fight was a stalemate in the corner. At one point with Lebay on the top, he threw palms but Takahashi came back throwing almost as many from the bottom. Lebay may have broken a finger as they stopped the fight to tape his finger up. The two fell out of the ring and when Takahashi was trying to get back in, Lebay started choking him before the restart was called and got a yellow card for it. When regulation ran out, Takahashi had the match won, but Takahashi threw several blows after the bell. Lebay tried to go after him and was held back. But the ref called a yellow on Takahashi, which was completely stupid on Takahashi's part to basically lose a match he had won. Takahashi had a mouse under his left eye. Overtime saw Takahashi outstrike Lebay on their feet, but he was then taken down. Lebay tried an armbar and when not getting it, was reversed. June 24th rings. This was a weird show because it was a 4-hour show. It was said to be easily the best ring show of the year, but because the matches were so long, a lot of the early matches were edited on television. Main event was one of the 3 or 4 best matches in the history of the company. 1. Ryuki Wayama upset Willie Peters in 1805 of a strange match which was a shoot. Peters, who is the far bigger name, had a 33-pound weight edge. The match kept going to the ground and Peters would keep it near the ropes and kept grabbing the ropes when Wayama would begin to get him in trouble. The rules of this match were 6 total points allowed before it was stopped. Wayama was ahead 5-0 when Peters surprisingly got a side choke but Wayama made the ropes to make it 5-1. Peters lost the match throwing a punch while he was up and Wayama was down for a yellow card in 1805. Peters pretty flagrantly did it but acted like he didn't understand why it was called. 2. Yasuhito Namikawa beat Minoru Toyonaga in a rematch of probably the best unheralded shoot match of 1998. This was also a shoot. Namikawa got a front guillotine in 9:51. Only a few minutes aired on television and it seemed to be a good match, but nowhere close to last year's match. 3. Wataru Sakata beat Boris Gilyaskov in 6:49 via tap out after Sakata was ahead 2-1. Also a shoot and also good. 4. Hiromitsu Kanehara beat Masayuki Naruse 2-1 in a match which went 30 minutes. Naruse was down 20 pounds from usual and this sure appeared to be a shoot as well. Naruse picked up a lot of speed dropping weight and was beating Kanehara to the punch on their feet early. Kanehara lost a point at 2:05 for a low kick yellow card. At 7:32 he got it back getting a rope escape point. This wasn't super exciting because it went so long and both guys were clearly exhausted by the end, but it was a tense match that the crowd really liked. About 28 minutes, Naruse was throwing forearms at Kanehara in the corner and one of them was ruled an illegal elbow, which on the replay, it clearly was, and a yellow card was awarded which turned out to be the difference. Very impressive performance by both guys going so long and the crowd appreciated it. 5. Ram Zaza beat Fulkan 9-7 after going the 30-minute time limit. This was worked as you can tell by a match with 16 points being scored. It's weird to have them work a 30-minute draw coming right off a shoot 30-minute draw. The points came a lot faster. The first 10 minutes were really good with a lot of points scored as the crowd loved Han's reversals. Zaza was this almost clueless worker who knew very little being carried by an experienced worker. However, by 10 minutes in, both guys were really tired. The points were coming fast enough that the crowd stayed interested. Judged as a worked match, I thought it was really bad because between points, Han was so tired he just laid there to set up the next spot. But the crowd loved it because the point spots themselves were good and they just appreciated seeing two guys do a 30-minute match as a shoot, even though this actually wasn't a shoot. Fans gave the two a pretty huge reaction after the match ended. 1.25 stars. 6. Joop Castile beat Bitsaje Terriel in 6:01 of another worked match. This was good, which is a surprise because neither of these guys would qualify as good workers. It got over because it looked real, with huge Terriel's blows not looking good, but with his size, people believed in them. Castile's offense was totally believable. Actually, this could have passed for real until the finish, with Terriel throwing a terrible-looking spin kick that missed badly and Castile getting a choke immediately. 2.5 stars. 7. Kiyoshi Tamura drew Yoshihisa Yamamoto in 20 minutes. The match started out good, slowed in the middle, and built to one of the best finishes of any match you'll ever see. It was clearly worked as they did the Tamura high spots with all the quick moves and maneuvers in between slow spots. Yamamoto got a yellow card in 7:24 for throwing a blow while on his feet and Tamura being down. A few more cool high spots. Yamamoto tied it getting a rope break after a choke at 11:05. Tamura got an armbar at 13:57. At this point I was wondering what the fuss was about this match because it was good, but there were only 6 minutes left and it was nothing great and almost disappointing because there was very little striking. The rest of this was like the 15th round of a Rocky movie, with great stand-ups and great submissions. Yamamoto tied it in 16:24 with an ankle lock. They were on their feet trading kicks, slaps and knees, and Tamura's selling of almost going down and being stunned was incredible. He finally went down at 18:20, giving Yamamoto a 4-2 lead. Tamura made the big comeback and knocked Yamamoto down at 18:55 to tie the score. They traded blows till the end. The crowd started chanting rings, like an ECW crowd after the draw was announced. 4 3/4 stars. Mexico. The biggest news in Mexico City, which has been in the newspapers almost daily, is that the original La Parka and Mascara Sagrada have been added to the Big Ocesa pay-per-view show on July 17 at Palacio de los Deportes in Mexico City. It's a one-night tournament with the loser advancing, and the ultimate loser losing their mask. Last year a similar tournament drew in the range of 20,000 fans. What has made this story bigger is that AAA promoter Antonio Pena attempted to get the Distrito Federal Commission to ban them, since he owns the trademark rights to both the Parka and Sagrada character, having won a court case over them. The Commission's eventual response was that they govern what goes on in the matches, and legal matters should be taken up in court. They said if Pena feels he's being infringed upon, he should sue the promoters using those trademarked names, and it's not the Commission's job. Black Warrior and Mr. Aguila are headed to Japan for Michinoku Pro's World Masked Man Tournament. EMLL and AAA have been added to Fox Cable Americas, which airs in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. Not sure if this also airs in the US on Fox Cable Español. They are airing EMLL Monday nights at 7 p.m. and AAA on Saturday nights at 7 p.m. These are the same shows that aired 2 weeks earlier already in Mexico in Televisa. Only details on the July 9th show Arena Mexico, which drew 5,000, was that Shocker and Mr. Niebla and El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas beat Scorpio Jr. and Blue Panther and Black Warrior and Fuerza Guerrera via DQ when Shocker again turned on his partners. If you think WCW angles can be annoying, think of this one, and the IWRG Mr. Niebla came out of the stands to attack Mr. Niebla again. All Japan. There were no major matches during the past week. The big story they are developing is that since the start of the tour on July 4th, Kenta Kobashi's team, usually in trios matches, has lost every night of the tour. Kobashi is selling his legit nose injury and wears a protective covering, although he may take the covering off this week. On the tour right now, but not wrestling, is a former University of Colorado football player Albert Moody, who is taller than Vader. Vader is attempting to have him train for wrestling in Japan and eventually work both with this company and in the US. Vader has continued to get fillers from ECW, although nothing direct, but it is unlikely anything will come of it because his situation in Japan with his standing seems to require doing no jobs, and ECW's main value in using him is to use his reputation to help one of their wrestlers, in particular Taz, get over by beating an acknowledged international superstar. Although publicly this is over, behind the scenes there remains a struggle for power in the company. There are also signs of financial cutbacks. While the Gladiator and Too Cold Scorpio are debuting on the next tour, neither the Road Warriors or Steve Williams, all of whom had expressed strong interest in working for this company as regulars, have been back since the Tokyo Dome show. In addition, some minor aspects of deals such as perks are attempting to be restructured. New Japan. Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa captured the IWGP Junior Tag titles from Jushin Liger and Great Sasuke on July 13 in Morioka before 3,500 fans when Takaiwa pinned Liger with a German suplex in 16:31. It seems the big angle is that tag champs Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto aren't working any house shows until they are put in a featured match for the tag titles. They'll be defending them against former Heisei Ishingun members Kengo Kimura and Shiro Koshinaka on July 21 in Sapporo. This has led to Masahiro Chono doing his rebel gimmick criticizing New Japan and Tatsumi Fujinami for bungling things up because the tag champs aren't even working the house shows. Most of the hype has been regarding building up the August 28 and October 11 stadium shows. It's pretty much certain that Nobuhiko Takada now won't be appearing at Jingu Stadium for the reasons gone into last week. It appears the October 11 Tokyo Dome will have a UFO vs New Japan flavor, with Hashimoto vs Ogawa and probably a Valley Tudo Rules, likely worked, match with Takashi Iizuka vs Murakami Kazunari and also likely Bryan Johnston vs UFO Big Van Vader, Sylvester Turkey, since they did an angle already on the June 29th UFO show. New Japan wants a big-name American star for the August 28th show, and Fujinami, Chono and Masa Saito are all going back to the US after this tour to meet with WCW officials about getting someone, the one they want being Bill Goldberg. It appears that Kunyaki Kobayashi has quietly retired, as he's working as chief of the New Japan merchandising department under Kotetsu Yamamoto. Kobayashi, 43, wrestled for 26 years with New Japan and All Japan, and his hot period was in the early and mid-80s with legendary matches against the likes of Satoru Sayama as Tiger Mask, Mitsuharu Misawa as Tiger Mask, Nobuhiko Takada, and he even was the opponent for Keiichi Yamada's first match ever as Jushin Liger on New Japan's first ever Tokyo Dome show 10 years ago. That match was considered something of a disappointment for the debut of what New Japan hoped would become a major character, which is kind of funny looking back and seeing where Liger has gone from there. Atsushi Onita is on some sort of publicity tour of Mongolia before he returns for an appearance in Sapporo. Akira will also return. Right now he's not working in a play. Other Japan notes. Antonio Inoki is trying to put together another big show in North Korea, similar to the 1995 shows, for the spring of 2000. He met with the second most powerful governmental official while he was there. At this point, Japan and North Korea as countries have basically closed business doors to each other once again, so this would be a huge mainstream occurrence and another way for Inoki to keep his name in the public forefront. To understand Inoki, you have to think of Hulk Hogan's motives, but with 20 times the mainstream real-world respect and credibility. Not saying he deserves that much more respect, but he does have it. He talked about possibly doing a show in the winter indoors at a 20,000-seat arena to build to a show outdoors in the spring using New Japan wrestlers. All Japan Women ran several title changes and angles, running 2 television tapings outdoors at the Fuji Network studios before 1,850 fans on July 10th and July 11th for a show that airs on July 18th. The shows used talent from most of the Japanese women's offices. On July 10th, Misaki Kana and Tsubasa Kurogaki, JWP, captured the All Japan Tag Team titles, beating Keo Nomi and Mio Wakizawa, while Kumiko Maikawa, All Japan Women, retained her All-Pacific belt, beating Misai Genki of Neo Ladies in 1549 with her X-Kick. They had 2 important matches for the current All Japan Women's Grand Prix tournament, with Manami Toyota pinning Momoe Nakanishi in 1653 in a battle of probably the 2 best current women in the company, and Yumiko Hata went to a 30-minute draw with Takako Inoue, which plays into an angle the next night. In the main event, the Neo Ladies team of Etsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda captured the WWWA tag titles, beating Zapsai and T in a 2 out of 3 fall match which went 33-14, ending when Shimoda pinned I with the Death Valley driver. The show was marred because it was raining heavily during the tapings. The next night saw Neo Ladies Kyoko Inoue win historically the most important women's title belt, the WWWA title, from Yumiko Hata in 2050 using the Niagara driver after using a WCW angle where Takako Inoue, no relation, but the 2 are longtime tag team partners and had a match against each other earlier this year, used a stun gun on Hata. This win sets up a match on August 25th in Kawasaki City Gym on a JD show where Inoue will make her first defense in a double title match against TWF champ Linus Asuka. They worked the match early to look like a shoot, doing submissions and punches from the mount along with punches and kicks to the face. Kyoko and Takako will start teaming again on August 11th for a Neo Ladies show at Korakuen Hall. Nakanishi also won the WWWA Super Lightweight title from Shaparita Asari of Neo Ladies in 11:43 with a dragon suplex. Maikawa retained the All-Pacific belt, beating Keiko Aono of LLPW in 12:31, and an interpromotional match saw JD and Neo Ladies join forces with Asuka and Mita and Shimoda over All Japan Women's Toyota and Kaoru Ito, Zappai wrestling without her mask as a babyface, and Nani Takahashi. Toryuman reportedly drew 5,100 fans to Kobe on July 11th for a show headlined by Magnum Tokyo and Kenichiro Arai and Tiger Mask and Great Sasuke over Sasuke the Great and Shima Nobunaga and Sumo Fuji and Yoshikazu Taro. In further women's news, JWP and JD are working together July 18th in Osaka, booking afternoon and evening shows at the same small IMP hall, and doing interpromotional matches on both shows with promotion versus promotion in an 8-woman and 10-women main event. Neo Ladies vs JWP takes place on July 21st at Korakuen Hall with 7 singles matches headlined by Kyoko Inoue vs Azumi Hyuga. Battlerts is doing another singles tournament, which I believe starts on July 20th and ends on August 20th with Alexander Otsuka, Minoru Tanaka, Katsumi Ujuda, Takeshi Ono, Muhammad Yone Karl Malenko, Rasta Man. This is not the same wrestler who used to wrestle as Rasta the Voodoo Man for the old Global Group and in Europe, but a Florida wrestler who worked indies as Navy SEAL taking the gimmick, and Yuki Ishikawa. Satoru Sayama is really trying to make a major push to sign Alexander Karelin up as his way to remain a big player in the game after the 2000 Olympics. Sayama's Seikendo promotion debuted on July 10 in Asahikawa before a crowd announced at 3,500. The show had 3 boxing matches featuring no-name Russian boxers and 2 pro wrestling matches. He announced a big show in October at the Ariake Coliseum in Tokyo. CMLL Japan announced its cards for a tour from August 8 in Kyoto through August 15 in Osaka with Mil Mascaras as the headliner. The 2 biggest matches of the tour are CMLL welterweight title match with Super Delphin vs Archangel on August 10 in Kawasaki and an IWA title match with Mascaras against Grand Sheik on August 15 in Osaka. That IWA title that Mascaras is bringing is the same old IWA title belt from Eddie Einhorn and Pedro Martinez's short-lived attempt to run a national wrestling company in mid-70s using Mascaras as their big draw, so he's been defending that title now for 25 years and will hold it until his death. Here and there. Jackie Fargo lost to Jerry Lawler and got his head shaved, and no, this isn't 1974. It was July 10 in Nashville where the 66-year-old Fargo put up his hair against the hair of Stacey Carter, which drew the largest crowd, 990 paid, in the history of Music City Wrestling. Lawler, who played heel, as he did when they had their famous feud 25 years ago, said that if he's elected mayor of Memphis, that he was going to have the city buy Nashville and use it as its garbage dump. Fargo was managed by Nicole Bass. Reports are that it wasn't a good match, but it was as good as it could have been, with Fargo showing good reflexes and throwing great-looking punches and Lawler doing a masterful job of carrying it through mic work and comedy. Fargo stripped Stacey down to her thong underwear, but Bass turned on Fargo and gave Lawler a chain for the pin in 14-19. Fargo got his head shaved, and also it was a match where Fargo put up the $20,000 of Monopoly money. Fargo somehow ended up with Bass bra, don't ask, and it really isn't something I'd want to think about anyway, and blew his nose in it. They didn't shave Fargo bald, but did leave him looking like a mess. Terry Taylor was supposed to wrestle Colorado Kid for the NA title, but Taylor said he couldn't wrestle due to emergency surgery and just did mic work. Taylor instead did an angle where he was recruiting Kid to sign with the WWF. Kid actually already has, and said if he signed they'd fly him straight to the TV tapings. The angle sort of worked in reverse because the crowd was cheering for Kid to sign. Taylor had to then say if he signed, that he'd never have to come to this stinkin' town again. Kid said that he wanted to go to the WWF, but not like this. Corey Williams came out and said he wanted to go to the WWF, and if he beat Kid, could he get the contract? Taylor agreed, but Kid beat him in 30 seconds. Taylor then KO'd Kid with a chair shot, and they indicated Taylor would be back at some point for the match. Bass also ended the Intergender Championship angle with Farron Fox in a horrible undercard match. Bass missed all her spots, including missing a low blow, which is pretty hard, although Gorgeous George managed to do it the next night. Even after its biggest crowd, Music City will be running Nashville less often, down to once per month, because the fairgrounds raised the rent to where it's borderline prohibitive to run. Some of the undercard matches were hampered because they used a WWF ring, which had the trademark WWF loose ring ropes and harder mats, but the ring crew wasn't allowed to make any adjustments. In Memphis on July 10th, they continued the angle where Tommy Rich, Doug Gilbert, Dirty White Boy, Dirty White Girl and Wolfie D were all trying to get into the studio but not allowed because they don't work for the company supposedly. There was an incident that wasn't on television and that few people saw where Gilbert and Jerry Lawler that morning did have words in the parking lot, which I'm assuming was not an angle because literally nobody was there except the crew, and Lawler drove off right away. They did a house show that night at New Daisy Theater with Rich and Gilbert and White Boy vs. BSK, the heel group run by Fatu aka JR Smooth, in a street fight. Rich was allowed in but refused to come in unless they allowed Gilbert in. Hales went outside and told Gilbert he'd let him wrestle at the theater but not appear on television. He said everyone but Gilbert could come in. Rich and Gilbert then got in a car and left. Hales got mad because Rich was supposed to wrestle on TV. After Wolfie won a match, BSK jumped him. White Boy tried to make the save, but Smooth then grabbed White Girl and kidnapped her, and the rest of the gang left Wolfie and White Boy laying. Hales asked Brandon Baxter to manage him for his match against Kevin Christian, but Baxter said no and he was going on vacation. Steve Bradley returned this week. Siren, Wicked's valet, is clearly a local woman and totally clueless at ringside. Lawler did an interview claiming the rumors about him having problems with PPW were false. They were actually true, but who expects a mayor to tell the truth anyway? Particularly when doing a wrestling promo? He said he hadn't been there because he had WWF commitments and had been on vacation. After all the TV pub from the night before, Lawler called Stacy Monica. Lawler wrestled on TV and pinned Bulldog Reigns. At the end of the show, Smooth dragged out White Girl, but then put her in a van. Rich and Gilbert returned at that point and started chasing the van but didn't catch it. At the July 8 Maryland Championship Wrestling show in Baltimore, many of the wrestlers, both faces and heels, came to the ring and did a send-off for Christian York and Joey Matthews, who are leaving for the WCW power plant as they signed developmental contracts, similar to what ECW did years ago for Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko. A lot of people were crying watching this. Mikey Whipwreck, Christopher Daniels and Jerry Lynn are scheduled for an IWW TV taping in Cardiff, Wales on August 29. UWA in London, England is bringing in Tiger Mask to defend his British Commonwealth Junior Heavyweight title. USA Today ran a big story on July 6 regarding how all the presidential candidates are trying to copy the strategies that made Ventura win his election. The 1999 Eddie Gilbert Memorial Brawl will take place on October 2 at Vineland, New Jersey High School. Japan's UFO is at least in preliminary talks about doing a show in California to be promoted by Sean McCulley. A group called High Risk Championship Wrestling is running Australia using Mark Lewin as the booker after going through various booking agents in the US, and on the tour currently are Nails, DOA, Pitbulls, Headhunters, and John Cronus. Apparently they have strong television on Australia Channel 9, the biggest station in the country, starting on July 18. Dory Funk will be doing a dojo in Florida from August 15 to August 20, training wrestlers for 1 week with the same training formula he used for WWF and All Japan. Sports Illustrated is working on a major feature about the lifestyle of pro wrestlers. The reporter doing the story did a piece for Icon magazine a few years back that was extremely favorable on Vince McMahon. Victor Quiñones is working on starting a full-time territory in Puerto Rico which would compete with Carlos Colon's WWC. Quiñones already has 13 weeks of television taped in the can ready to roll out, which included a lot of major Japanese names along with most of the Super Astros crew from WWF. The plan is to open running 4 to 5 days per week in October or November with a 20-man crew which would include Miguel Perez and Savio Vega as the top stars along with Super Crazy, Yoshihiro Tajiri, who probably wouldn't be brought in until 2000, Headhunters, Ricky Banderas, Jose Estrada Jr., Jesus Castillo, Fidel Sierra, and Ricky Santana. The basic deal, since Perez, Vega, Castillo and Estrada are all under contract to WWF, is that they can syndicate the show in Latin America, but not within the continental 48 states of the US in the WWC. Ray Gonzalez is doing a gimmick where he said he's going to become company president and fire all the Colons. Carlos' son is training to start his career. When Pierre Roth Jr. left for Mexico, El Nene was brought back to WWC as Gonzalez Universal title challenger. Mustafa, formerly of the Gangstas, is headed in while Mark and Chris Anthony, Mike and Chris Lazansky, are in as well. Colon's son, Carly Colon, was attacked by 4 heels, Gonzalez, the Bouncers, and Dutch Mantle. Carlos was called on the phone and arrived and saw his son on the dressing room floor and said even though he isn't ready to return, he challenged Gonzalez and Mantle. Colon's first match back is June 6 in Ponce, teaming with Abdullah the Butcher against Mantle and Gonzalez, and the next night he faces Gonzalez in a singles match. Sean Hill, back to Florida where he lives. Brian Logan and La Tigresa are gone. Jose Rivera Jr. won the tournament to crown the vacant Puerto Rican heavyweight champ on July 10 in Guaynabo. Previous champ was Colon. Maelo Huertas, younger brother of Invader No. 1, won the WWC Junior title from El Rockero on July 3 in the same city. Huertas is a full-fledged heel under contract to Chicky Star. Invader No. 1 and Star are feuding over the contract. Jungle Jim Steele, Wolf Hockfield, also returning this coming week. Extreme Pro Wrestling, a new group notable if only because it will have several porn stars including Rob Black, Tom Byron, Ashlyn Gear, Jasmine St. Clair, who was once on an ECW pay-per-view show, Lizzie Borden, Didn't She Give Her Mother 40 Whacks, and Christy Mist promoting the product debuts on July 31 in Reseda, California at the Country Club. NWA New England tapes TV on July 25 at 1 p.m. at Good Time Emporium in Somerville, Massachusetts. All Pro Wrestling on July 24 in Susanville, California has Donovan Morgan vs. Tatanka and Brutus Beefcake vs. Virgil. Donovan on July 9 in Thomaston, Georgia. Actually, the combined age of these two guys was still probably less for real than for Lawler versus Fargo. Pro Wrestling returns to Nassau in the Bahamas at Nassau Stadium on July 17 using Typhoon vs. Earthquake plus former Florida headliner Tyree Pride, Cuban Assassin, Miguel Perez, Ricky Santana and Marty Jannetty appear. MMA. It appears the Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz main event for the September 24th UFC in Montreal is back on. It will be interesting to find out what rules will be in effect because Quebec laws governing mixed boxing, as the sport is called and regulated in Quebec, somewhat differ slightly from UFC rules. Ebenezer Fontes Braga was pulled from the July 16th pay-per-view match against Paul Jones due to his losing on the Pride show on July 4th, and he'll be replaced by Flavio Moura of Brazil, of whom I know absolutely nothing. Got a chance to see the last 3.5 matches from the Pride show, and it probably belonged more in the Japanese pro wrestling section. Saw probably the last 8 to 9 minutes of Guy Mesger vs. Hira Shoji, which went via split decision to Shoji after they went 25 minutes. It was a very close fight with nobody, at least based on what I saw, gaining a clear advantage. It appeared Mesger was the better fighter of the two, but it also appeared he got the more tired of the two as the match wore on. There is no question that was a shoot. Naoya Ogawa vs. Gary Goodridge, if it was a work, and it probably was a damn great one. They gave each other shiners and Goodridge never seemed to be holding back on his punches to the head, which is the usual giveaway. This fight really put Ogawa over the top as a wrestler/martial artist in Japan because it was really exciting. It did look like a very good rings match except with closed fist punching and some great exchanges. Worked matches usually are more exciting than shoot matches anyway. Match had superheat and Goodridge was bleeding all over the place by the end of the first round, and Ogawa won with an entangled armlock in 38 of round 2. Braga vs. Kazushi Sakuraba was a shoot match and also very good, with Sakuraba looking very impressive, winning in 9:22. Surprisingly, I'm pretty much certain Mark Kerr vs. Nobuhiko Takada was a work, which is funny only because Kerr would have killed him in a shoot. For one, Takada was surprisingly calm going in, which he wasn't going into past shoot matches. 2. The fact he taped up one shoulder and Kerr went to that shoulder for the hammerlock submission isn't necessarily a giveaway to give him the out for tapping, but wound up being it. A few years back in another so-called shoot organization, they had booked Dan Severn vs. Mitsuhiro Matsunaga, a pro wrestler who Severn would have easily handled in a shoot. The night before, Severn was contacted and told he'd go over in 1 minute, but it was a work because they simply didn't want Matsunaga injured, and that's what I think this was as well. Takada over the past week talked about wanting a third match with Hicks and Gracie in September. Takada doing the job may have been Kerr not wanting to lose. Punishment for Takada not doing the job for Ogawa or the company when he refused to put Ogawa over, basically putting him in with a guy he can't beat as punishment, figuring Takada is fading and Ogawa can be built into the new top star anyway since he's undamaged goods. Kerr's hamstring was pretty red as he took some wicked leg kicks before putting Takada away. An irony pointed out to be about shooting is that when Takada faced the guy who is pretty much a myth as the best fighter in the world, the match was reality, and when he faced the reality of the best fighter in the world, the match appeared to be more of a myth. Most people considered this the best Pride show to date. The press coverage focused far more on Ogawa's win than Takada's loss. Now that Ogawa's rep as a shooter was made, he won't be appearing on the September 12th Pride show in Yokohama, claiming a shoulder injury in the Goodridge match, which may be legit, and also may be a way of having to pay another opponent big money for put the guy over, and it would be difficult for a more memorable match than the Goodridge one. They've served their purpose and now it's time to keep people with that fresh memory of him leading up to the Hashimoto match. Parinya, a Thai cross-dressing kickboxer, had his final fight as a man on July 8 in Osaka, losing by decision to a Japanese fighter. He'll be undergoing a sex change operation soon to become this weird cultural tabloid freak for the Japanese press. When he becomes a woman, there are forces at work trying to put together some sort of a shoot match against Shinobu Kondori. We've gotten a live report and seen photos of the Gilbert Yvel vs. Semischult match, which was a match of a top contender for the Rings title against a top contender in Pancrase, held in Amsterdam, Holland on a Rings Holland show. Our original reports were incorrect regarding the point scoring, as Schultz didn't get 5 rope break points. He actually only had 2, while Yvel had 2 knockdowns before winning with a second round knockout. From the photos, Schultz's left eye was swollen totally shut and he looked like a guy who had just taken a real pounding. ECW. It was a pretty quiet weekend with 4 shows in Florida, none of which were television tapings. The biggest news was that Scott Hall showed up at the card in Orlando, Florida on July 11th, which was held in a small bar. The matches were said to be good, with the Dudleys apparently having the best brawl they've ever had, but the crowd was overflowing, 900 in a building that couldn't even hold 800, and close to out of control. Hall was hanging out at the bar, making sure everyone could see he was there, and fans were chanting for him during the matches to the point he was taking attention away from the matches. He was playing to the crowd back as well. Bubba Ray Dudley tried to do an angle yelling at him, saying he should be at the WCW pay-per-view, which was taking place at the same time in Fort Lauderdale. Not sure exactly what Hall was doing there, if it's just because he wanted to go to the bar or see the show. He was there with a doctor friend of his, but he was at a WCW booking meeting this past week, and he should be back imminently with a major role since Nash is booker. There was also a near incident involving Bubba Ray Dudley at the show. A fan looking for trouble wound up going after sign guy Dudley. Devon punched the guy in the face, and the crowd at ringside, many heavily boozed up, were getting out of control. Bubba and Devon were shoving fans trying to get at the guy. Bubba threw chairs and threw a table at the guardrail, nearly hitting several fans before security got things under control. The 4 shows were July 8th in Fort Lauderdale drew about 1,200 for a very good show, July 9th in Cocoa Beach drew about 450, July 10th in Tampa drew a hot-packed house of 1,500, and July 11th in Orlando. Mike Awesome came to one of the shows and was running the ropes and appeared to be fine. FMW Super Leather, real name Mike Kirchner, who was actually something of a star in the WWF in the early 80s as Hogan's buddy Corporal Kirchner, doing the patriotic gimmick after Vince fired Sergeant Slaughter at his drawing peak over a contract dispute, but has to be around 40 today, worked in Cocoa Beach and did okay. For insurance purposes, they didn't let him use his chainsaw gimmick. He was being looked at to potentially do a hardcore gimmick program with Balls Mahoney. Mahoney missed the weekend because he had third-degree burns legit in his back. It may look like it's magic and they don't get burned, but it's really a freak show spectacle, but it gets over big, so they'll keep doing it. Rob Van Dam missed the Orlando show because over the weekend, there was a jet ski accident involving himself, Sabu, and his wife Sonia, which wound up with his wife getting her leg shattered, and it was pretty serious. They've been doing Jason vs. Jazz matches every night to get their act down for the pay-per-view, but people who have seen them thus far are having a hard time figuring out why the match would even be there, as the bouts have been really bad and the angle and characters aren't strong enough. If there's any doubt as to who the most powerful man in wrestling is, it should have been answered this weekend. It's Tampa DJ Bubba the Love Sponge. The 400-pounder has now headlined for WCW, WWF, and now ECW, having had a horrible match in Tampa against Bill Alfonso. Alfonso is said to have done a great job as the local promoter for the Tampa show. TV this week was from the ECW arena 2 weeks ago. Francine vs. Dawn Marie Bitch Bikini Contest saw Francine in a very tiny bikini, and she got jumped by Dawn Marie. Just Incredible King Tommy Dreamer, who is out of action for perhaps quite a while with 2 herniated discs in his lower back and doctors have recommended surgery. Storm Incredible wound up beating on Sabu and Fonzie until Jerry Lynn's saved. Sabu did a plunge over the post onto Storm Incredible. Whenever I see Francine with almost no clothes on, which seems to be about weekly on ECW television, unlike the other women in this business, I always feel sorry for her. It looks basically the way she has to look for her role, and the fact she has to go out in front of 1,000 guys in thongs and is close to 30 and can't have any cellulite, which isn't easy. Getting that look has nothing to do with getting aggressive in the gym. But she looks so drawn and haggard from not eating or whatever she does, and the stick arms and legs standing on those 20-inch heels make her look like this anorexic woman with giant implants, and it's so sad. Don't get me wrong, if she gained 15 pounds, she couldn't go out in a thong and she'd wind up on the scrap heap, but this look these women have to try and keep as they get in their 30s, and this is not even a knock so much on wrestling but on the pressures women see from photos of models who don't even really look like that either, except when they've starved themselves for photo shoots in pop magazines. Models, strippers, actresses, and even competitive women who hang out at the beach all have similar pressures to a degree, but it's still rare to see someone as drawn and anorexic looking in those professions, and I know what they do in women who literally don't eat more than a handful of oatmeal a day for weeks on end, and they never look that drawn either. And unlike the WWF women who clearly had the benefits of cosmetic surgery far beyond implants to create the fantasy sex object look, they at least look like they don't have eating disorders, whether that's the case in real life or not. I can remember Missy Hyatt as her day when she had to do the bikini stuff, and she'd literally not eat to get that look for so long she'd almost, and I believe once or twice actually did, pass out. And Missy never at her thinnest without food looked as drawn as Francine, and at that time she was a lot younger than the women on top, so to speak, in the WWF today, who have to keep that unattainable look. RVD beat Mahoney in 15 minutes in a match that was more a ton of run-ins. RVD does good spots, but they are so slowly set up against a guy that big, so they had a too choreographed look. Not much heat early, but the place was on fire at the end. Actually, if this match was on Nitro, people would say it was terrible in the first half. Mahoney then killed 1,000 of RVD's brain cells with a sick chair shot. The Dudleys ran in and Mahoney gave them both chair shots, with Buzz being very sick. He brought in a table and barbed wire, and as Joey Styles noted, this barbed wire didn't have rubberized tips. Fans chanted fire real loudly. Bubba poured what seemed like an entire bottle of lighter fluid on the table, squirting it while making motions like he was jacking off with it, and they put Mahoney through the table to a super pop. Van Dam made the save doing a Van Daminator on both guys, and Frog splashed Kentucky Fried Mahoney for the pin. Styles pushed how Mahoney had the match won with his chair shot before the Dudleys ran in. Anyway, after a few years of going to Tijuana, I was able to completely turn off all my sympathy at seeing dozens and dozens of starving children on the street begging for money at 2 a.m. on a Friday night, so ECW should eventually desensitize me to seeing 1,000 fans yelling for a guy to fulfill their entertainment needs by allowing himself to get third-degree burns on his back. My reaction watching it is that it's really sick, but I'm working on not being such a buzzkiller and not caring about this and just enjoy it like we can enjoy every car crash on the highway. Hey, and I know Terry Funk did almost the same thing, and I saw him come back from Japan in tremendous pain with a torched hand to get over an angle that wound up never being concluded, so it's like he did it to draw money later that never even happened. Mick Foley is practically a deity for risking his physical and mental well-being later in life so we can all, or at least some people, can be momentarily entertained and some can have fond memories, and he can be a legend and nobody has to worry about 10 years from now because it's all entertainment. So why worry about a guy who works very hard and takes a lot of punishment and is doing it so he can finally get over? Taz did an interview challenging a bunch of people, including Shane Douglas and Bam Bam Bigelow, but mainly it was a promo on Steve Corino. Storm and Credible over Sabu and Lynn was the main event. They did all the gaga about Sabu being suspended, but since Credible had asked for it to be unsanctioned, it was his words that allowed Sabu in. Lynn threw Credible off the stage through a table. Sabu put Jason through a table. Storm shoved Sabu off the ropes and he went through Fonzie on a table. Match ended with Credible caning Sabu and Lynn, and Storm using Lynn's own cradle pile driver on him for the pin. It had its spots tell the story, but the heat was no better than okay except for the aforementioned table breaks. It appears Joel Gertner will be doing color commentary on the TNN show. WCW Nitro on July 12 sold out the Jacksonville Coliseum with 7,945 fans, which was 6,861 paying $123,265. This was the best Nitro in a while, as it actually seemed to have a purpose. They opened with Savage challenging anyone but Nash for a title match. Hogan came out to a big face pop and accepted. Savage said he meant anyone but Nash and Hogan. Gene explained Savage can't go back on his word. Doesn't Gene know he's working for a wrestling company? Savage eventually agreed. They built this up the entire 3 hours, had a main event of a decent length and gave people a payoff at the end so people went home happy. I recognize you can't put a face over for the world title every week, but the basic formula is so simple it's mind-boggling how bad WCW usually screws up. Conan beat Vampiro via DQ in 3:03 after Vamp threw a chair at him. Fans hated the finish but match was good. Vamp got a big pyro ring introduction and is getting a push now because the booking committee was very impressed at him for winding up last week on Nitro getting a fat lip and a black eye from Rick Steiner punches and never complaining, so he's getting a little push. Conan is getting buried because of the USA Today remarks. After the match, Vamp laid out Conan again with a sidekick and a Michinoku driver. Conan did get a big star reaction. Bobby Heenan brought up how Mike Tenay had told him it was the first ever singles match between the two, true, and how they hate each other. It has been true in the past, from Mexico. WCW book so ass backwards. Shouldn't these guys do interviews for weeks, and God knows anyone who has met either of them knows they can cut a promo on each other to build to a match so it means something, except then this might get over and they might have people care about the match. Miller came out with a cape that read Godfather of Soul. Of course he meant James Brown. They don't realize that most of the wrestling fans probably think he's talking about the guy on the other station pimpin' hoes nationwide. Miller was hilarious, because he challenged Buff and his mom, but then said Buff's mom in the super heavyweight division so she'd have to come down a weight class before he'd face her. Buff eventually came out to accept the challenge. Not only are Buff's interviews bad, But he just turned his back and left and got jumped, and the fans were acting like they were mad at him for being so stupid to turn his back on a guy he just challenged. Anyway, Bagwell made his comeback but went after Sonny Onoo, allowing Miller to kick him with his magic red shoe, and Onoo counted the pin. The bell rang at the 3 count like it was a match or something. Ric Flair beat Malenko in 8:47 with Charles Robinson as ref. Bischoff came out to announce. Flair and Anderson kept double-teaming Malenko while Robinson would just watch. Malenko would get all sorts of pins on Flair, but Robinson didn't count. Very good heat. Flair looked old, but he always gets heat and gets the other guy over. Ref bump number 1. Johnny Boone ran in. Asya, someone explained to me her purpose, unless she's there to shame all the guys who don't into taking roids because a woman on the show is more muscular than almost all of them, packed Boone. This finish was very strange. Malenko reversed the figure 4. Robinson got back up. Malenko very clearly, even though in the advantage position, for some reason tapped the mat repeatedly. Robinson called for the bell because Malenko tapped. The announcer screamed at the bogus call, and they'd have been right, except Malenko clearly tapped. Flair and Anderson beat on Malenko until Sting saved. Sting challenged Flair to a match for the company. He also blamed Flair for holding back himself, Luger, and the Steiners for the last 10 years. Does anyone realize following Sting's career that whenever he flies on his own, he usually does well briefly, then crashes? Then at some point they program him with Flair and he gets over again? Let's see, Flair has put Sting over 5 billion times over the last 10 years, and Sting has put Flair over maybe a dozen times in the same period, all with gimmicked finishes. It wound up with David Flair versus Sting, and if Sting won, he'd get a match with Rick for the company. Kidman beat Regal in 10:57. Kidman was awesome and Regal did a great job putting him over. This is the kind of a match that gets killed in the ratings, so I wouldn't put it on Monday, but it was very enjoyable. Kidman took one bump over the top where he flew over like a bird and crashed. Regal still badly needs to drop weight. Ref bump number 3. Finlay and Taylor joined in the fun. Finlay hit Regal with a chair when Kidman moved. Kidman went for the shooting star press and didn't get enough distance, and nearly killed himself going down. Bischoff was supposed to run in and count the fall since they're building to him having a more prominent television role as babyface president. Kidman had the wind knocked out of him and from his landing could have been seriously hurt. Regal, in a scene reminiscent of the night Austin beat Owen Hart for the IC title, basically cradled himself for the pin. Bischoff shoved down David Taylor after the match. The British pub posse then yelled at Eric, but I guess they saw those karate videos he did when he was chasing down Vince and walked off wanting no part of him. Bischoff actually sold, saying when Finlay was threatening him he saw his life pass before his eyes. I usually see the same thing about halfway into a 3-hour Nitro. Sid Vicious pinned Kenny Chaos in 3:49 with a power bomb. The crowd was chanting Goldberg heavily. I know it takes incredible insight to figure this out, but it made me think fans may want to pay to see Goldberg versus Sid, and WCW should book this match at their house shows. Sid, sensing what was happening spontaneously before his eyes, didn't ad-lib a bit, and instead challenged Sting, which is what he was supposed to do, but could have at least hyped what people wanted. Fans still chanted Goldberg. The Nitro girls were in silhouette looking like they were doing a pole dance at the strip club combined with a lesbian love scene. Luckily WCW isn't so desperate for ratings that they won't go in that direction. I wonder what Rena Mero thought of that one? Oh yeah, it was like a tastefully done pole dance at a strip club. Sting wrestled David Flair for the US title. Sting got the Scorpion right away and David was tapping, but Robinson ignored it. Sting used the Scorpion Death Drop on Robinson for ref bump number 4 and beat up Flair and Anderson as well and didn't sell a thing. Sting was getting over as these guys bumped like pinballs for him, reminiscent of a 1987 Dusty Rhodes chorus line. He then did a stinger splash on Flair and Asya. Somehow in all this, the match ended and Sting didn't win. But later they announced Harvey Schiller and Brad Siegel were watching and they have more power than Flair, and next week Rick faces Sting with the company at stake. I guess the fact Sting didn't win has nothing to do with it. So next week Flair can put Sting over for the 5 billion first time and then Sting can give the presidency to Bischoff. Damn, if Schiller and Siegel actually watched this show, they'd have fired Nash and the rest of the people booking this crap months ago. They presented Finlay with a hardcore title trophy from winning the JID match the night before. All the guys who were in the match from the night before that weren't hospitalized ran in and Jimmy Hart stole the trophy. They've almost never let Finlay talk all this time, and he's a little 80-ish as a heel because that's his generation, but he was really good. The problem is, the last two guys given a chance to talk who turned out to be good were Jericho and Conan, and see how much mic time that got them. The triad did their same catchphrases. Bata bing. Bata boom. Bata boring. Booker T versus Page went 15:56. This is usually way too long for a Monday match, but the audience grew, probably people tuning back to see Hogan versus Savage. Ref bumped number 5. Canyon interfered with the flatliner but T kicked out. Canyon pulled out powder but T kicked the powder in his eyes. Finally Bigelow interfered for the DQ. They did a double-team diamond cutter on Nick Patrick, number 6, second of the match, and double-team cutter on T. They tied T to the ropes and were having their way with him when Stevie Ray came out to a big pop. Crowd chanted Harlem Heat big time. Sets up what could be a good tag feud except Ray's in there. Hogan won the title from Savage in 14:15. Hogan got a big pop when he came out at the start of the show, but not nearly as big as you'd think for this match. Considering Savage can't move and Hogan is so limited, it was pretty good. The crowd liked it. Hogan gave Miss Madness and Medusa the double noggin knocker to the same big pop. They ended up fighting each other. There have been people wanting to get those two away from Savage, feeling as detracts from Gorgeous George. It does. But without them, Randy has nobody to work the matches for him. Anyway, WCW is going to bring back women's wrestling with Medusa as champ and Miss Madness as her first challenger. Match was pretty bad until Savage began whipping Hogan hard with belt shots over and over. He missed the elbow and it was Superman comeback. It's been so long it wasn't even that annoying for the first time. Crowd was into it. Sid ran in. Sid was pounding on Hogan. Crowd was groaning, figuring it was the same run-in DQ finish that ends every Nitro. But the bell never rang. Eric then brought up for the first time at this point it was a no DQ match. Fans chanted for Goldberg. So Sting came in after Sid. Ref bump number 7 was around here somewhere. Nash ran in and powerbombed Savage and Hogan pinned him to win the title. Nash grabbed the mic and then cut a promo on Hogan for holding him down and challenged Hogan for a title match which headlines Road Wild pay-per-view on August 14th. Here's the situation involving Sturgis. Because WCW is so far behind last year in revenue, there's a lot of heat about giving away a house show gate and concessions gate by playing Sturgis, which is also always a bad show because of the nature of the crowd and the show. But it's been basically Bischoff's perk and the guys into bikes love it, but the rest of the guys hate going there. As it looks right now, and this could change, particularly if business picks up, this will be the last Sturgis pay-per-view. At one point we're talking about doing a pay-per-view like Starrcade 85 and 86 where they'd have 2 locations, with half the matches in one site which would be an arena and the other half in Sturgis. The idea was to make money from the one house show gate. By the time the idea got through committee, this sounds like a state legislature now. It had been changed to just Hogan versus Nash would be at the arena, and they'd book the Manhattan Center in New York for that match and the rest of the show would be from Sturgis. Nash was all for that idea, pushing hard because he's part of the group that hates going to Sturgis, and Manhattan Center he figured he'd be over in because of his WWF days working there and would be a building fans would cheer him above Hogan. The obvious problems, which thankfully someone must have thought of, were that running a 1,000-seat building totally defeats the purpose of doing the show to begin with, to make money on the live gate, because the cost of hooking it up for a show and getting the screens to transfer the shows into both locations would eat up more than the entire gate, plus by today's standards, the Manhattan Center would look like ECW Arena or far too minor league for a WCW event. As mentioned, Hall should be in imminently. Nash wants time off from the ring to concentrate largely on booking. Shane Douglas has signed and will, as things stand at this moment, be part of a new 4 Horsemen. The planned angle is that after Flair Sting runs its course, and by then this may all change, is for Flair and Anderson, who will return to live action, to face Benoit and Malenko for the Horseman name. Both sides have been given the impression they're getting the name, so nobody really knows. The idea for a finish has been for Douglas to show up and screw one side or the other and join that side. If he helps Flair, no doubt it sets up him screwing Flair later. Anyway, among the combinations suggested for Horsemen over the last few days include Flair and Anderson and Douglas and Hennig, Flair and Douglas and Wyndham and Hennig, which makes perfect sense given the storylines which turned Wyndham and Hennig in the first place, Benoit and Saturn and Douglas and Hennig and Benoit and Saturn and Malenko and Douglas. In the interim, before these decisions are made, they are shooting more videos of Hennig as part of the West Texas Rednecks. Kiss really will be playing at the August 23rd Nitro in Las Vegas, doing either 1 or 2 songs. It won't mean crap in the ratings, but this is a really huge deal in Japan for whatever that is worth. Insane Clown Posse appears on July 19th in Rockford. This also won't mean crap in the ratings, but isn't a huge deal in any country I'm aware of. It also has the Flair Sting match for the presidency on top, and Dennis Rodman appears. Rodman is going to be the biggest waste of money in company history this time. The entire No Limit Soldiers angle is falling apart since the Rednecks got almost as many cheers as they did at the pay-per-view, and they were so cold. Of course, it's been half-ass booked that way because Hennig has come out looking cool from the start, and the Soldiers are basically one of those incompetent babyface groups that never gets anything done or gets their revenge back and is always outsmarted. Mysterio Jr. has to quit doing that hooty-hoo because that's dying a brutal death. The head honchos that actually watch the Georgia Dome Nitro were also very upset about the Lodi and Lenny Lane characters, which is why they weren't on Nitro this week. Head honchos are Time Warner execs. The booking committee loves the gimmick obviously, thinking Lodi and Lane are the most talked about guys who never win a match in history. I just hope if they bring them back their breakups are more convincing than Stephanie and Joey on the other station. Wrath should be back in 2 or 3 months. The entire Savage post-show incident from the Georgia Dome was edited off the Canadian version of Nitro. Nash complained to many people about Hart's interview ending at 9:03 p.m. when it was supposed to carry a quarter hour. WCW did a masterful job on Thunder and Saturday Night of editing the interview and putting it to music, and it appeared it was a classic interview through the magic of post-production. Goldberg basically got what he wanted when asking to renegotiate. Goldberg was at the Georgia Dome and talked to several people about being upset with Hogan's mainstream media remarks directed at him while he was gone. Jericho has one house show left, on July 21st in Peoria, before he leaves for WWF. He worked July 7th in Montgomery, Alabama, teaming with Guerrero, losing to Kidman and Mysterio Jr., and they apparently stole the show. Jericho was heavily cheered and a large percentage of the fans knew he was leaving. Nash is in the process of selling his home in Scottsdale, Arizona and moving to Daytona Beach, to be closer to working full-time in the office out of Atlanta. For June 25th in the UK, Raw drew 340,000 viewers to Nitro's 300,000 and Thunder's 200,000. From July-January 98 to July-January 99 in the UK, Raw beat Nitro by a 39.92 mark in head-to-head weeks with an average of 331,000 viewers for Raw and 280,000 for Nitro. On BBC Two in the UK on July 6 on the Louis Theroux Weird World show, the host went to a Nitro event and to the power plant. The host made the usual remarks about it being fake, so trainer Buddy Lee Parker made him do calisthenics until he puked and was laying the smack down on his candy ass and swearing pretty heavily at him. They also went to an indie show where they showed guys setting up spots and showed how they bladed, which is still largely new material to the British audience. Thunder on July 8 in Birmingham opened with Nash saying he was putting the title up in the tag match on the pay-per-view. The reason they waited until the last show before the pay-per-view to make that announcement is because nobody realized they'd forgotten up to that point to reveal that detail. Lane pinned Eddie Guerrero in 3:05 when all the masked guys attacked Eddie 5-on-1 and Psicosis leg dropped him off the top to lead to the pin. This should set up a program with Eddie versus Psicosis, but WCW won't let those guys have a program because they're all too small. Gene interviewed Disco. Disco was funny talking about what a terrible wrestler Miller is. Van Hammer beat Al Green in 2:15 with a Cobra Clutch Slam. Shiner spanked him after the match. Finlay beat Brian Knobbs via DQ in 2:05 when Hugh Morris and Jerry Flynn interfered. Most of the show saw Jimmy Hart recruiting people into the Battle Royal. Since he had 3 guys already in, why would he want more people in since it only lessens his guys' chances of winning? Mark this one down. Piper did a great interview ranking on Bagwell. It'll probably be the only one he does this year. They announced David versus Malenko for the US title on the pay-per-view. Flair was going out of his mind. You know things are bad when I don't even find Flair entertaining anymore. Disco NC Kidman in 4:14 when Miller interfered and kicked Kidman. Disco hit Miller with his last dance. Benoit pinned Canyon in 10:28 with a diving headbutt. Best TV match from any company in weeks. Someone explained to me why during a match of this caliber with the Great Intuit that they break from the match to show Jimmy Hart trying to recruit Mikey Whipwreck into the Battle Royal. Bigelow interfered first. Then Saturn ran in. Page ended up running in but had to slow down and overplayed getting tangled in the ropes, as either he got there too fast, or they got to the pin too slow. Shouldn't complain as this was very good. Hennig then pinned Conan in 2:54. Conan had a million guys in his corner but they still couldn't stop Wyndham from interfering and laying Conan out immediately. And they wonder why the No Limit Soldiers didn't get over? For the July 14th show, it was B.A. and Chase Tatum and Swollen over Finlay and Regal and Taylor. Vamp pinned Hammer, who was none too happy about it. David Flair kept the U.S. title beating Eaton. Kidman beat Whipwreck. Sick Boy beat Rick Fuller and the Triad kept the tag belts going to a no contest with Hennig and Barry Windham. Another reason why without a governing authority over this industry, that drug testing can't work in real life. If a wrestler of any prominence continually fails a drug test and based on the enforcement procedures that should be enforced but wouldn't be and gets fired, the fact is, the other company could hire them the next day, and it looks to fans like the company doing the hiring has pulled this coup. Goldberg and Nash went to the house show July 9th in Macon, Georgia. Goldberg was booked for the show and said since he wasn't wrestling he brought a replacement, and Nash ended up defending the title and beating DDP on top. Many note that did that for Macon, but in a city like New York or Philadelphia there are a half dozen no-shows and they don't bring in any replacements. Hart got a lot of heat this week for a remark, meant as a joke but it didn't come off well at all in his Calgary Sun column, saying he was at the Calgary Stampede over the weekend and saw two dogs having the time of their lives rolling in manure and said it reminded him of the British Bulldog who would do anything to get a job in the WWF. Earlier in the week a reporter asked Stu Hart his feelings on Bulldog, who earlier in the week talked about going back to WWF. Stu basically said the guy is a wrestler and has to make a living. My own feeling with things in the position they are in is that it is in Bret Hart's best interest not to talk about WWF at least until this case is settled, except if he wants to talk about product mix, which is an entirely different issue. It's in Vince McMahon's best interest not to talk about Bret Hart until that same time frame unless he wants to defend comments about product mix, which is, again, an entirely different issue. Both come off at this point bad whenever they talk about the other. Our legal system is often the farthest thing from fair and just, but both sides have to hope that it will be that for them and that is their place to plead their case. Hart is being considered as one of Canada's top athletes and as a possible torchlighter for the Pan American Games, which will be held in Winnipeg next week. Leading candidates, once the obvious pick, Wayne Gretzky, turned it down, are Winnipeg native Tanya Dubnikoff, Dallas Stars goalkeeper Ed Belfour, wheelchair athlete Rick Hansen, national volleyball coach Garth Pishk, 1992 Olympic bronze medal winning Angela Chalmer and kayak racer Victoria Jason. Juventud Guerrera was banged up a little on the July 5th Nitro, taking the elbow from Savage, who lands way too hard with it as a way to protect his bad knee, but he was fine a few days later. Guerrera went home as his wife gave birth to a baby boy. Lanny Poffo is still under contract making $75,000 per year. Norman Smiley was given the okay to work in Mexico. Universal Soldier 2 will be released August 26th. Lex Luger should be back in the ring in 2 months. There was a lot of backstage upheaval and finger-pointing in the wake of the Georgia Dome show. Apparently, while the show grossed nearly $600,000, costs of doing the show were more than $1 million. They are looking at a Hogan and Sting vs. Savage and Vicious and Goldberg vs. Flair double main for August 20th in San Francisco. Business this week saw WCW Saturday Night taping on July 6th in Columbus, Georgia drew 2,033 paying $38,496. July 7th in Montgomery, Alabama drew 2,992 paying $64,240. Thunder on July 8th in Birmingham drew 6,639 paying $137,505. July 9th in Macon, Georgia drew 3,377 paying $74,220. Don't have all the merchandise figures, but it was working to around $4.89 per head. Sting did a lengthy interview for John Patton in the Miami Herald on July 9th. He seemed pretty candid. I'm kind of skeptical about his answer when asked about steroids. He claimed never to have done them after his second year in wrestling and said he thinks WCW does what it can to combat use. But the rest of the answers hardly read like a guy saying the politically right thing to say, as the majority of wrestlers' media interviews turn out to be. And after the Conan USA Today deal, you know why that is. He said he talked to McMahon before he signed his latest contract. He had already shook Bischoff's hand on the deal without signing before talking to McMahon and indicated he didn't take McMahon's offer seriously because he already shook Bischoff's hand on the deal. He also knocked the current WWF products, saying he's got 2 kids and would never let them watch 1 second of their programming. He said he owned the name Sting, thus could take it with him if he left WCW. When asked if wrestlers need to unionize, he said yes, saying it's hard for them to get life and medical insurance. When the Owen Hart natural question came up, he said he, Sting, was put in the situation, but it was his decision to do it and was always given the option of saying he didn't want to do it. I can't say it wasn't scary. It's scary every single time I do it, and it's a risk every time I do it. But every time you step into the ring it's a risk. He said he didn't want to testify in the Hart trial but said he knew he may be deposed against his will. As far as coming from the ceiling again, he said never say never. People are going to do that in different professions, and it's just what the entertainment business is a lot of times. These special maneuvers, and all the bells and whistles that go with it, and yeah, there's a chance that this could happen again. He said he thought WCW gave away his match with Goldberg too fast. He said he pushed as hard as he could to have the first match saved for a pay-per-view but to no avail. When asked about the ratings situation, he said he thinks WWF won't sustain their current ratings forever. He thinks if advertisers were going to pull out over content, they already would have. He said it just seems strange to him to see tanda, sexual innuendos and trash talk followed by commercials for super soakers. A lot of parents let their kids watch this stuff, which is mind-boggling to me. He compared it to Springer, saying that he used to flip the channel and pause to watch it because he was intrigued, but now a few years later, he didn't really care to watch Springer because every show looks the same. He said WCW went ahead because they had more realism to their shows and Hall, Nash, Bischoff, Hogan and himself had great ideas. He said the problem was they all started getting too far over the top and started becoming insulting to their audience, and WWF had more realism to their show, and said the spontaneity on Nitro went to hell. It's the same old thing. When we advertise a main event on our show, on Monday Nitro, you watch and it's 10 minutes before the end. Well, if I'm a fan at home watching, I'm going, well, they've got 10 minutes here, what's going on? And then there's an interruption in the match and you don't deliver. There's no payoff for people watching. You've advertised this main event the whole program, and there's no payoff. There's no winner and there's no loser. There's a run-in. He talked about WCW needing to create new stars. He said the people that matter in WCW totally disagree with that philosophy, and said he thinks all the promoters disagree with that philosophy. He knocked the recent fake Sting angle, saying been there, done that, and said he's out there and can feel it not working. He said he's never seen ECW. When asked about if WCW told him to stop wearing the trench coat after the Columbine massacre, he said he didn't want to do it anymore and told Bischoff that, and Bischoff agreed. He said he's looking at resting 2.5 more years before retiring. I think every wrestler is obligated in an interview to say something like that. Alex Wright was backstage at Nitro in Atlanta. WWF. A couple of notes on the July 25th pay-per-view show. The tag title match with Acolytes vs. Hardy Boys will turn into a 3-on-2 with Michael Hayes teaming with the Hardy Boys, and based on what was said at TV, it appears Mick Foley won't be ready for the three-way, and Rock vs. Triple H will do a singles match with the winner, most likely Triple H, getting the title shot at SummerSlam. Shamrock vs. Blackman will be a Lion's Den match. If Ventura is the ref, this allows Triple H to get the rub from Ventura to hopefully put him over the top as a headliner. Speaking of Hayes, WCW is often criticized about use of talent, and even though Hayes would need to get in better shape to be able to be taken seriously as a wrestler in the WWF, he's younger than actually almost every WCW headliner these days. Hayes is the same age as Sting and younger than Luger, not to mention everyone you know he's younger than. And he's probably one of the 3 or 4 best on interviews in the company. Kind of like WCW with Arn Anderson, who is one of the 3 best promo guys in that company, but they never utilize him on interviews. And with talking more important in wrestling than ever before, it's strange in both cases to see guys who talk that well being buried. Raw on July 12th in Louisville drew a sellout 14,573, paying $352,045. Show opened with Austin doing an interview. McMahon came out in a wheelchair. They bleeped out Austin calling him an asshole. They argued before a contract signing, and Undertaker came out and hit Austin with the belt, and he juiced. Undertaker then took a pen and supposedly filled it with Austin's blood, so McMahon signed the contract for the pay-per-view steps in Austin's own blood. I'm not sure what kind of a mind thinks of things like that, but I thought it was pretty creative. Edge double count out Gangrel in 5:43 when they both left, and Gangrel threw Edge into the pit. He comes out of surrounded by fire. We never heard about Edge again, so I guess he's still down there. Down where? Sorry, that's last year's catchphrase. X-Pac and Road Dogg tarred and feathered Howard Finkel for telling the cops where they were last week. Now didn't they find Road Dogg in the ring to arrest him? Speaking of which, how come they didn't arrest Chyna for vandalism and for filing a false police report when it came out she spray-painted someone else's car? Godfather and Venus beat Hardys via DQ in 133 when Hayes interfered to save the title. Acolytes came out and all 7 guys brawled. They did a vignette to reintroduce Tori as a sex symbol. Anyone want to bet me over the next 6 months that this Tori becomes a bigger star than that Tori? Jarrett and Deborah came out. She looked mad at him, which means something for a few weeks from now. Austin hit the ring and stunned Jarrett and challenged Undertaker to a no-rules match. Big Show came out and asked to be his partner. Austin left. Then Jarrett started doing a promo, so Austin came back in the ring and stunned him again. Rock and X-Pac and Road Dogg beat Triple H and Gunn and China in 6:44 when Rock pinned Gunn with the People's Elbow. Good TV match, but Ross needs to drop the Brad Pitt with an attitude comment on Billy Gunn because he sounds more like Lodi than Jim Ross when he says is. Speaking of weirdos, they had an evening gown match under hardcore rules with Snow versus Draws. Snow ripped Draws' dress off to win in 1:59, leaving him in his panties and pantyhose. Somebody needs to keep a list for this year of how many WWF wrestlers are shown wearing panties. I mean, just the guys, because we know we'll see every woman in that company in them before this year is out. A doctor told Mark Henry he couldn't wrestle because his blood pressure is too high. That was weird. So Henry and Brown couldn't wrestle the Acolytes. Acolytes came out wanting a fight and Bob Holly came out doing his big shot gimmick. They beat him up. He's getting amusing. Big Show saved him and a groggy Holly told him how he was giving both of them more than they could handle. We saw Stephanie telling that loser Joey Obs she didn't want to date him. Apparently, and we didn't get this straight, either Stephanie dated him once because Shane wanted her to but he was so immature she never did again and he pleaded he'd changed but she shot him down big time. She was cold. I was feeling sorry for poor Joey and it's hard to feel sorry for a guy who dresses that badly. Later in the show it was revealed Joey was Stephanie's former boyfriend. Sounds like a wrestling story that gets bigger every time you hear it. Somewhere this weekend they talked about how Stephanie went out on a blind date with Test. Don't they know one of the prerequisites of a blind date is that neither party has even seen what the other one looks like? That's where the word blind comes in. If they've seen each other's faces and one asks the other out in front of 15,000 fans, it inherently can't be a blind date. I started out writing about a fake sport and I'm going to end up like Dr. Laura. Test had a gauntlet match. First he beat Pete Gas in 50 seconds. Then he beat Rodney in 56 seconds. Pete and Rodney crack me up. I see them in 15 years both clamoring to be the next Howard Finkel. They were like salivating over getting the chance to be the one to take out Test. Let's see. Every single time these guys get in a fight, they get their ass kicked. Mick Foley beat them all up at once. X-Pac hit one of them and they both took a bump. They couldn't even last 2 minutes with geriatrics like Patterson and Brisco. So now, one-on-one, they are clamoring to get their hands on Test, who is, like twice their size. Test was beating on Joey when Shane showed up, and when Shane was getting beaten on, Steve Blackman showed up, but Ken Shamrock started fighting in. Stephanie showed up and Shane accidentally didn't see her and knocked her out. Shane freaked out over what he'd done. Austin and Big Show beat Undertaker and Kane in 9:45 when Austin stunned and pinned Kane. Austin bled again trying to sell the idea he bleeds easy and thus is the underdog in a first blood match. Mainly a brawl and it was better than you'd think. TV tapings for July 13th in Lexington, Kentucky. It opened with a dark match as Colorado Kid beat Tracy Smothers. For Shotgun, Gangrel beat Brown when Midian attacked Brown and Edge then attacked Gangrel after the match. Chaz beat Kurt Angle, which may have been a arc match. Glenn Ruth beat Rob Conway. Meat beat Blue Meanie. Heat started with Undertaker calling out Kane and saying the two were absolutely together, which means they absolutely are about to split up. Road Dogg NC Jarrett when Dogg hit the ref with Jarrett's belt. Gunn and China came out and attacked Dogg with a chain and X-Pac made the save. X-Pac beat Holly via DQ for a chair shot. Same finish as the last pay-per-view match. Kane made the save and choke-slammed Holly. Show choke-slammed Kane. Taker came out to help Kane, but Show and X-Pac ended up arguing and Show choke-slammed X-Pac and carried Holly to the back. Draws and Albert beat Acolytes when Acolytes were distracted by Hardys, Godfather and Venus fighting outside the ring. That result indicates Acolytes getting the belts back soon. Big Show and Triple H when Taker and Kane attacked Show. It wound up with Taker and Triple H brawling as the show went off the air. Raw as No Contest started with the CM interview which ended with Taker and Triple H brawling and McMahon setting up a match between the two of them with the winner getting Austin on the pay-per-view in the title match. As Yogi Berra would say, this was deja vu all over again. Austin came out with a blood donor truck and said before the night is over somebody was donating. Dogg NC China in a dog collar match when Gunn ran out and destroyed Dogg and they hung him over the ring ropes. Shane said he'd apologize to Stephanie and not only that, he'd let her date Joey again. She slapped him. Like anyone believes a guy that dumb is heir apparent to run $1 trillion company. Hardys won a four-way over Godfather and Venus, Albert and Draws and Acolytes. Jarrett kept IC title beating Christian but after the match Edge came out and beat up Jarrett and he got a bloodbath. Gunn beat Rock when China hit Rock with a chair and a famouser finish. I guess God had to put the Rock in his place. Bossman NC Snow and Bossman tied him up and beat him with his nightstick. Edge and Brown beat Midian and Gangrel. Test NC Blackman when the posse ran in and attacked Test, and then Shamrock made the save. X-Pac and Kane NC Holly and Show when Undertaker came out and choke-slammed X-Pac. Kane saw that his brother was of a low moral character as if killing his parents didn't convince him, and refused to leave with Undertaker and then choke-slammed him, carried X-Pac to the back. Finally Taker NC Triple H when Austin and Rock both ran in and they brawled all over the place. Austin wound up getting the title belt and hit Vince with it and he bladed, so Vince was the donor. But Taker came out as Austin was doing his beer can celebration and hit Austin with a beer can and he juiced, and the show ended with Taker holding the belt above his head with Austin bloody. After the show went off the air, Austin gave everyone stunners. Rena Mero filmed a commercial and TV infomercial for an ab roller, and she's also doing a cosmetics commercial and fielding scripts. The new Playboy, which plugs next month's issue, had a note on Sable by that name and not Rena Mero for a second shoot, promising it to be more steamy than the first. Viewers' Choice Canada carried the Ventura press conference live. Jimmy Garvin was backstage at the Greensboro show. He's now working as an airline pilot and weighs more than 250. Some WWF wrestlers were mad at Hogan saying how he'd never worked for WWF on Larry King when he was at the funeral telling people how he wanted to be back in WWF. Austin threw out the first pitch at the Mets-Yankees game on July 10th at Shea Stadium. Heat on July 11th in Indianapolis drew 11,121, paying $261,720. Big Show came out, looking like anything but a salesperson for the long-term benefits of liposuction. He also debuted his new catchphrase, "That's the last word." These guys coming up with catchphrases are coming in on the tail end of a trend, and that's not the place to be. Brood lost to Bossman and Midian and Viscera when Gangrel again turned on Edge, causing him to lose. The CM team was awful even in a 206 match. Al Snow wrestled 4 Mexican minis for 316. Ungodly bad until they jumped off a body ladder on him and Max Mini used a corkscrew plancha on Snow. They all simply walked to the back and the match was over. Rock did the greatest interview of his life. Maybe the best WWF interview of the year. Hardys went to a no contest with Draws and Albert in 52 seconds when Godfather and Venus attacked Draws and Albert, and Hardys did simultaneous planches on everyone. While the Hardys were risking their bodies to entertain the hardcore audience, they were chanting "We want hose." For those interested, Draws was wearing a skirt and a tube top. Test beat Mr. Ass in 43 seconds when the posse ran in. This skit was dying until Rock ran in and attacked Billy, and Shamrock went after Blackman to save Rock. Finally Kane pinned Bradshaw with a choke slam after Holly hit Bradshaw with a chair in 3:43. Kane choke slammed Holly after the match and Big Show KO'd Kane with a weapon after the bout. Weekend house shows saw July 9th in Philadelphia draw 14,562, paying $363,648, and July 10th in Evansville, Indiana drew 9,113, paying $180,515. Basically everyone but Undertaker worked Philadelphia, with Austin over Triple H via DQ on top and Rock over Bossman and Big Show over Viscera and Jarrett over Shamrock via count out, fighting with Blackman. In Evansville, both Austin and Taker had it off and it was Rock over Bossman, Jarrett over Shamrock by count out, and Show over Viscera. Merchandise for the week was $354,994 or $7.19 per head. Thought the Millennium Countdown on Raw actually ends on August 9th, which apparently also coincides with the debut of Jericho, so he may be billed as something like the man for the new millennium. The July Autograph Collectors magazine had a very negative article on a recent Sable appearance, saying her attitude left a lot to be desired, with fans unhappy because she wouldn't take off her sunglasses for photos with fans. Her lawsuit against Titan was transferred from U.S. District Court in Bridgeport, CT, to Hartford. There was a huge and very good front page article on the suit in the July 4th Hartford Courant. The new Austin and Rock videos are 1 and 2 on the sports charts this week, while Michael Jordan, who broke Austin's nearly 6 months at number 1, is already down to number 4. The new women of the WWF debuted at number 5, while Wrestling with Shadows debuted at number 10. WWF has 13 of the top 20, WCW is down to 3, and for some reason a Roddy Piper action movie is listed on the sports charts at number 18. The Philadelphia Daily News on July 6 did a cover story called X-Rated Wrasslin', about the WWF leading to the house show in the market 3 days later. It, like every media wrestling story of the past week, tried to tie the death of the 3-year-old in Dallas whose older brother was emulating Austin and Undertaker to the current product. The story was talking about the women of the WWF and said Chyna looked like Sylvester Stallone with a bad wig. The story had advice for parents whose kids like wrestling to go to the video store and rent a tape before deciding if you want your kids to see it. Suggest the kids watch WCW instead because the story says it has less sexual content. If parents don't want their kids watching wrestling, suggesting they watch WCW is a very clever way of doing it. Talk with kids about what they do and don't know about the characters and the language being used. If kids want to watch WWF, limit them to the morning shows. And finally, if you think it's too risque, don't let them watch. Salon magazine ran an excellent story about the aftermath and handling of the Owen Hart death and its potential effect on the WWF. It was the first non-wrestling publication story to explain that Hart was spoofing Sting when doing the skit and was supposed to flop in the ring as a comedic entrance rather than a heroic entrance. The story said that the fans live and at home wouldn't even get the joke anyway. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine.